Thank you very much for joining us today. This is the Aspen City Council work session for December 12th, 2022. On our agenda this evening, fleet electrification update, employer-sponsored housing program, affordable housing in the land use code, and rent relief subsidy waiver program for the yellow brick childcare tenants. And we are going to flip this around a little bit. We're going to take the yellow brick first, then talk about the employer housing, then we'll do the fleet and land use conversation will be last. So with that, welcome back.
Thank you for welcoming us back. Let me share my screen. Slideshow. There we go. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So, hello, members of council and mayor. Thanks for meeting with us today. We met last week, as you remember, and one of the items that we discussed was the rent relief program, the waiver program for the child care providers in the yellow brick building. And you wanted some more information about the leases and the leases that the city holds with the child care providers before you wanted to make that decision. So we have only 4 or 5 slides. It's going to be really quick. We know you have a full agenda. Our question for you is, does City Council support a 1, 2, or 3-year relief, rent relief waiver program for the child care programs at the yellow brick building? So that's our big question. And here is the rent information that you were looking for, the lease information. And you can see on this slide that all 3 of the child care programs that are currently in the yellow brick are paying rent based on their leases. The ELC will be signing a new lease starting September 1st with the option for a 3-year lease. Aspen Mountain Tots has a lease that goes into effect September 1st for 3 years. Ajax Cubs, we just signed a lease with them. They have a 1-year lease with the option of an extension for 2024 and 2025. So effectively 3 years from January. And the revenue from those leases, or really the revenue that we will not be receiving, is roughly $138,000. So this number would go up because rent is increased by 3% each year. So if council decides to offer the waiver, each of these tenants would receive a rent relief waiver equal to their monthly rent totals multiplied by 3 for a quarterly amount. And I'm going to just keep moving until you have questions. So this is the proposal. Beginning January of 2023, the child care programs in the yellow brick will receive an application that they can submit for a rent relief waiver. So it's a voluntary program. It's not required. The child care programs will develop an agreement with Kids First to provide reporting, including a quarterly report with successes and failures, staff feedback and retention and recruitment numbers, along with accounting for funds with balance sheets and projected costs, and most importantly, an agreement with planning describing where they'll spend those funds. They will be used for employee supports only, and this is a requirement for participation because the goal of this program is to support directors to retain and recruit child care staff. That's the big priority. So by saving this money, by not paying rent, providers can offer benefits that will directly impact retention and recruitment, including health benefits. They could offer vision and dental insurance, time off. They could hire a new float teacher or additional teachers, shorter work days, longer breaks, professional development, retirement funds, health or wellness funds. So there are a lot of different options that they would have, but they would have to create a plan for that to show that those funds are going directly to their program staff. And then lastly, we'll provide feedback and results to you all, to City Council, on or before the 2024 finance planning sessions. So what questions do we have?
I'm curious if these benefits extended to teachers is going to affect the BOCC's contributions.
No.
It's a rent waiver as opposed to an employee bonus of $500 a month.
Yeah, I understand that, but it is to the benefit of the, so if, that's my question. If the county's going to not give funding because these early childhood teachers are getting some kind of benefit from this, then I'd be interested in extending it longer until the county doesn't have that requirement.
Right. And this is not the wage increase. This is not that. If directors were reporting it back as that, that might impact, excuse me, what the county is providing. But that wasn't my understanding of what they were planning on doing.
And I'll just add to that a little bit. The county's program actually puts $500 in each person's pockets directly to the employees. The employees will be responsible for that and paying taxes and stuff like that. What our funds are going to go to are things that they can't buy themselves, or this might not be able to afford, like group health insurance or a wellness plan, within the school, having shorter days or hiring a new employee. So staff don't have to work all day. They have an hour planning period. So it's going to be more of a benefit that's not cash in their pockets, but benefits that other employers offer, like the school district, benefits like that.
Thank you.
Have you talked to the providers about this? And did anybody indicate that they would not be taking advantage of this?
We have talked to some of them, and one of them was on the fence. I think it depends on what the requirements are and if they're willing to do that, the reporting.
So like the reporting?
Yeah, because there's strings attached. It's not free money.
Okay.
We also had a provider who was really excited to be able to offer health insurance. I mean, this is just for these providers in the yellow brick, so talking to them, we interact with them a lot every day. So, I think we've had a lot of conversations of how this might be able to be used. Health insurance is a really high priority so far. We have Ajax Cubs, who's brand new, and we really haven't had the opportunity to talk to them about how it would benefit their program. But I'm sure for hiring, being able to offer, again, benefits or planning time would be beneficial.
Rachel?
Thank you. There's really only a couple of things that I would add to this. I think it should be something that if any of the agencies could use some of this to build their reserves, depending on their current financial sufficiency. But, we all know that there's ups and downs, and seeing them build reserves, I would feel is also a beneficial use. I don't know the rest of the council, again, if they seem to be insufficient or below. But we had talked prior about kind of business plan improvements and getting some training, and we had talked about that in accord with the wage enhancement. But would this be also something available to them, but not a requirement of this program to have some professional business management skills taught to them?
Yeah, well, the same programs will have that business management training available to them.
Okay, but it's not a requirement of this rent subsidy? Okay. And then the second question is just basically, I was thinking, when they're doing their financial reporting anyhow for grants going forward. Is this really much in additional reporting requirements? I mean, we would have their 2022 budget and how those funds were spent and be able to compare it to what they submit as going forward end of '23 wrap up. So is it really a lot of new reporting or just being able to see where the line items grow from the rent reduction?
I think it would be a little bit of both. You know, I think it's areas of reporting that they haven't reported out before, and like you said, really fleshing out the line items instead of a more generic line item on
Administrative costs.
expenses or, yeah,
Okay.
that we're asking them to really point to those dollars directly and say, these dollars equal what we received in a waiver, you know, and this is an enhancement that we didn't have before. So comparing the budgets may be part of their responsibility, but also part of ours too. And we don't see this, although we're asking for stuff in writing, it's not going to be turn in your paper, you know. I think it's going to be, let's sit down and talk about this. I think it's going to be more of a conversation.
Sure.
That we can flush out and really make sure that it's working.
Yeah, I mean, we want to see this fulfilling the intended use, and I'm fully supportive of this. The one thing, you know, just the years, I don't know what other people are thinking. I would say at least 2. I don't think we want to go 3, just 1. It's really going to take a little time to adapt to the reporting and perhaps even find the appropriate benefit that is most instrumental in retaining staff for
Great.
each provider. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's kind of really what they need direction from us for. I agree, 1 year probably too short. I would support 2 at this time myself, so other, Ward, John?
I would support 3. I think that we should have an ongoing, long-term benefits to the early childhood providers. So it's not a huge amount of money in lost revenue. So,
Okay.
Yes, this being one of our top 3 goals, I fully support this for a minimum of 2 years.
Yeah, I can understand what you're saying, Ward, and I had thought about, well, should we say with an option to renew or something? But I think it's important to see the proof in the pudding and how the dollars are spent. And I think, you know, we may, over time, see providers who are not in a city-owned building asking us for rent relief as well for their facility. So I'd like to make sure that we're getting what we're putting the money in for and then can extend it rather than, you know, 36 months and then, you know, decide whether we have to pull back or what the new rate should be or how it happens. So,
how does 24 months guaranteed with a check-in at 20, somewhere a year and a half? And
well, I think we talked about a check-in at the very end of '23. So we'll be getting some.
I'll check
information.
in to renew for another 12 after the initial 2 years.
Or I think that's a great point. There should be a midpoint. There should be notice and understanding, and people can work it into their budgets if it's going to be extended. So I think that's a great point.
Skippy, I'm sorry, but I cannot see you or your hand raised or not, so I'm just going to call on you occasionally.
Sure, and I am here if you can't see the video and it's the hand raise, if that helps. But if not, you just call me. But yeah, 2 years, comfortable with that.
All right. Thank you.
Great. So 2 or 3 years, it sounds like I have 1, 2, 3, 4 of you are for 2 years, 1 for 3. So are we going to go with 2 years? Mm-hmm. Okay.
And the check-in.
And the check-in.
The check-in.
Council
And they're going to be reporting quarterly, so that's really,
When to expand it.
yeah, a lot of accountability. Great.
And just one quick follow-up. Rachel had brought up the idea of being able to use it for reserves. Is there a majority of council that's supportive of that?
Again, only if they're currently insufficient, but they could start building program reserves.
You know, I don't want to be prescriptive, so I'm open. Like, I don't know if that's where this would be helpful. I haven't had direct interaction with the providers to know what they're thinking or where this would be helpful. I don't know if these requirements that are going to prohibit anybody from even taking advantage of this. So I'm open. I mean, if that's, I
I was just thinking it was one potential use to add to the list,
Yeah,
not just be above any others.
I don't want to be restrictive necessarily. So, and it sounds like the different providers may have different areas that they could use it. So it's fine with me.
Yeah, I think if they're freeing up some funds, that they might be able to divert the funds they were spending on support to the teachers to reserves.
And again, I'm just thinking if it's undercapitalized, underfunded, and we see the ups and downs with the
Right.
pandemic and all sorts of other issues. So I'd like to see a chance for them to build reserves.
No, I thought it was a great idea. Just wanted to make sure to confirm there were 3 of you. Thanks.
Thanks, Dan.
Thanks, Diane.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for your time. Have a great
Megan.
night.
Thanks, Nancy.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Next one, employer housing. I'm wondering.
Anybody else seen The White Lotus? That might have been a scene from it.
What? What did I miss? What was just there?
Skippy.
Oh.
In a really nice hotel room, it looked like.
Yes, unfortunately, I've gotten sucked into watching that.
I saw one episode.
It's not good.
White Lotus?
It's not good.
I was watching a miniseries, Inside Man. Inside Man is, what's his name? Stanley Tucci. It's interesting. It's only four parts, but he's a character that is just catches everything on observation. He's in jail for murdering his wife.
I gotta.
You ready for me?
Ready.
I'm ready. All right, Alyssa Farrell, Administrative Services Director. See, I have a concise presentation as well on City of Aspen, our own employer-sponsored housing programs, our internal housing program for our city employees. On the heels of childcare, talking total compensation and benefits, one of our benefits for our city employees would be our employer-sponsored housing program. So with that, I'll move into our agenda. Feel free to ask questions throughout the presentation. The agenda today is really talking about our recruitment and retention data, which is one of our many catalysts for focusing on housing. We always focus on housing, our own employee housing, housing for the community, and then our employee housing survey highlights, internal housing overview, next steps, and questions and discussion. So this is truly today providing an overview of where we're at and next steps and ensuring that we have an update and that we're moving in the right direction with council.
And so to clarify,
feedback.
we're not asking for any council direction this evening. We're just providing you an end-of-the-year summary after your conversations earlier in 2022, and you asked for some of this information to come back to you.
Thank you, Sarah. All right. So in 2021, council provided and adopted our total compensation philosophy. one that I endearingly, affectionately call the TCP. So it provides our overview and our foundation of where we're heading. And there is information around housing support for our staff within the TCP. Focusing on responding to the high cost of living, as we all are within the community, in order to continue to provide community services at the level that the city of Aspen does. We need to focus on housing support, and we'll get a little bit into the data around why that's so imperative. So within the TCP, we have responding to the high cost of living and the lack of affordable housing through an array of housing program options, and truly being creative and innovative within our housing program. It could include our housing inventory. It could include focusing on our down payment assistance program. There's truly a myriad of different options that we're looking to explore based on the data received. So with that, we'll jump into the recruitment and retention overview. And again, this data provides us a catalyst to jump up with housing as a priority for us to focus on for this coming forever, right? For our focus on 2023. Similar to other large employers, as we know and we feel it on a day in, day out basis, the city specifically is experiencing unprecedented turnover rates. So our average for 2022 has been 17%. The target and what we focus on as a goal, some turnover is healthy, and we recognize that too, is around 10%. And that comes from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, specifically with government and resort communities. It also comes from Employers Council data. So we're well above that. We're also looking at our exit interview data. Why are our employees leaving? What's causing turnover within the city? And we would say there's a variety of reasons. One, of course, is housing and affordable housing, as we well understand and know. We also are seeing extended vacant positions. So when we're hiring for City of Aspen positions, they're extended for, it could be a year, as long as a year and a half, that we're going without filling positions, and you have other staff members picking up the additional workload, and that's very concerning. And the feedback that we're getting is within some of the vacant positions is when we're interviewing qualified candidates, we do have a withdrawal of qualified candidates, and we've always gotten it, but not to this extent, around looking for affordable housing options, and that's truly a contributing factor. And we do have top candidates actually withdrawing their application at a higher level, an unprecedented level than I've seen in almost my 20 years with the city of Aspen. So this is a new frontier, truly, as it relates to turnover, the vacant positions, and the correlation with housing, affordable housing options. And this all results in a community impact with the services that we're providing to Aspen. Yes?
Yeah, let's see, you say 17% at the city. I wonder, with other governmental sectors in the region, what is the turnover rate there?
It's pretty similar to that number, so it's not, we're all experiencing the same housing pressures. Even talking to my counterparts in Garfield County, they're struggling with this. We recently actually just completed a survey for cast members. All the resort towns are feeling this as a new level of pressure and are, quite frankly, very envious of our position right now with the forethought of councils in the 90s to start this program.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Any other questions? Check in. So again, to your point, we are all experiencing unprecedented turnover rates and these different variables. We're being proactive, or we're being responsive to the need of looking at housing and resolving sooner rather than later more solutions. And it's all in line with our total compensation philosophy. Over the summer in 2022, we did an employee housing survey. So we had actually a 60% response rate. And these are the highlights. It's also in the memo as an attachment and overview there too, with, we have over 50% of our employees living in Aspen, 24% living in Carbondale or further down Valley. 80% of employees believe that if their housing situation were to improve, and we know this feeling, we all experience it to some degree until you're able to truly land in Aspen, believe that it would be likely or very likely to influence their decision if their housing situation were to improve to remain employed with the city. There's a direct correlation in the feedback that we received. 97% of employees prefer to own a home, and 64% currently do own. So I have a few slides on the housing survey highlights here. This slide I find fascinating, and it's really because you have one extreme or the other extreme. So no stress as it relates to, the question is, in the past 6 months, how would you rate your stress level about having a secure and long-term viable housing option? So you have no stress, they figured it out, or extremely stressed. So it's one.
Or it should be reversed.
Oh, I think you're right. There's a wide split amongst the stress with employees. So if they're able to secure housing long-term, they figured it out. They've won the lottery, right? If not, otherwise, then there's a high degree of stress. Again, I don't think any of this is surprising information. It is helpful information and data that we've collected.
Let me ask, Alyssa, how detailed is it in your ability to perhaps cross-tab some information, because I respect people's privacy. I wouldn't want anything like that to get in there. But, I'm kind of wondering, on the own your own home, 64%, how many are somehow approaching closer to their retirement years, and perhaps we're able to either get into free market housing or the affordable housing program prior. But how close are we with retiring employees adding to the existing vacancy issue, and people retiring who may already have housing? And if it was free market housing, that's really not going to be replaced by anyone else. Or even the APSHA units, if people have won a APSHA unit and they retire and leave the community, it'll go to lottery, not necessarily back to a city employee. So do we have a sense from the people who are housed, how many are housed in city housing, so it's kind of secure? How many are free market and likely to retire? Or how many? Yeah, I mean, I'm just kind of wondering, maybe that's work for the next go-round on this.
Thank you. We do not have that data in the housing survey that was completed here. We do have within our housing inventory that information, of course, with our 67 units, and we would have access to the information for city employees. So it's something that we could look at as we move into our next steps.
Yeah, I think it'd be really good, because this is about long-term planning. As you said, the housing started in the 90s, and what we are able to accomplish or start over the next few years is going to be for both current need, but also what the city will need as turnover and retirement happens. Thank you.
Thank you. So a few slides here on our housing survey highlights. So within this last slide on the survey highlights, we do have a current, it's fairly restricted down payment assistance program. And this is really understanding where employees would like to head. So 59% are interested in the down payment assistance program. Currently it's for APSHA units or city units with a restriction of up to $30,000. So that could be something to assess for the long term and in our next steps. 51% of our employees are interested in some form of shared equity program, something worthy to explore. Employee housing unit in Aspen, you have 64% that are interested, and in Basalt, a close second at 56%. So we recognize truly that Aspen and Basalt are where employees would like to head.
Alyssa, could you give some cliff notes on the down payment assistance program?
Yes. Actually have a handout here as well. So the down payment assistance program, it's really about, it's available for full-time employees in good standing with the City of Aspen, and it's to help provide a secured subordinate loan to assist eligible employees in the purchase of a primary residence up to $30,000 or 10% of the purchase price, whichever is less, for a loan amount of up to $800,000 or less. And it's only available for APSHA units or city-owned units. That's the Cliff Notes.
So what we heard from employees is they'd like us to look at, is there a way to support down payment assistance in free market? In general, that's the consensus of what the feedback came back as.
What kind of interest rates are on these and repayment terms, et cetera?
It's low. The maximum loan term is 15 years. The interest rate is fixed at the time of application. It's equal to the most recently published 10-year U.S. Treasury rate.
And what kind of participation do we have in that now?
We have around 1 or 2
Yeah,
per
the
year.
program's too restrictive. That's generally what we're hearing back from our staffs, is the $30,000 amount, and trying to go through the lottery process and needing to have your finances set up in case you win a lottery at APSHA. It's just not really conducive to the way the business is being done in the community right now. While we're particularly interested in revisiting this and seeing if we can make it a more attractive option.
So what happens is employees have this sense of excitement when they first hear about the down payment assistance program, because they think it could be valuable and something worth exploring. That, and then they learn of the restrictions that are currently in place, and there's a level of, they're disappointed, frankly. So as Sarah mentioned, looking at expanding that program and looking at the restrictions is something that's definitely on our list. Any other questions?
I have a question. I don't know if anyone can see my hand.
Cannot.
Can I jump in?
Go right ahead, yes.
Sorry about that. All right, I'll just holler. I'm just curious about that. I mean, I can understand for a category APSHA unit, you know, most local banks will, you know, give you a 95 or 90% LTV. So, you know, this is kind of not necessary addition, or at least it's unlikely to be the delta between opportunity and not opportunity for most. But I'm wondering, what are people looking for? Are they looking for assistance to buy down valley, or do we have employees that are shopping free market in town?
They're looking primarily, I would say, in Basalt, Down Valley for a residence. There could be a few in Snowmass as well.
Got it. And so do we have a geographical limitation on, I mean, I know that we don't do this yet, so we're talking about expansion, but do we have in our mind frame a particular geographic fence for where this would or wouldn't be eligible at this point?
That would be premature for us to comment now. That's a lot more conversation with employees, understanding their travel patterns of not only themselves, but also their family members who may cohabitate with them that go in opposite direction. So there's a lot of considerations before we would make a recommendation on what this program looks like.
Okay, thanks.
I'll jump in as well with the question. Because I was, in reading the memo, one of the discussions, and it may have come from the housing credit discussion, but was, should it be expanded to the entire urban growth boundary, or should the urban growth boundary be expanded to the Aspen School District, things like that. And, you know, that's a real conversation with the county, one way or the other, if that's what we're talking about, expanding different boundaries for construction of new, or for using the housing credit program, which is a separate memo in the same thing, but it talked about where our boundaries are. And so I just had wanted.
Could you just clarify how that relates to our 67 units? Because we're not making the connection of the ones that we fully control as an employer to what you're.
Well,
you're
what I'm
bringing up.
talking
I just wanna make
about
sure we
is,
understand.
as the work goes forward, to think about, should employee housing units be built in basalt, or employee housing units outside of our current employee boundary, urban growth boundary, even though it might still be qualified as Pickens County. I'm just kind of wondering if we're starting to think about changes for a different program that is also a housing program, and is there a way to have some parallels or concurrency with it. And I don't know if we've had internal guidelines that say the city doesn't build housing outside of the urban growth boundary or doesn't purchase housing outside the urban growth boundary, things like that. So that was kind of the comment.
Okay, that's really helpful. Just as a friendly reminder, you've purchased 2 units this year.
Yeah,
One of them
Snowmass
is
and-
outside of the urban growth boundary.
But it is within what's it, Brush Creek or Snowmass Village proper?
It's in the village of Snowmass Village.
Right, so it's a municipality. It's kind of within their urban growth boundaries, even though it's not ours. So anyhow, it's just not rural and remote, you know. What I wanted to get to on this is I do look forward to seeing continued work, and we clearly have a need, a pressing need. But I would want to see how the down payment assistance program and the shared equity program work together, especially if it's the purchase of a free market unit. It seems inappropriate to loan someone the money for a free market unit and then not share some of the equity that is going forward. But this is just something to look at. I know the county has done a shared equity program, and in some ways, it'd be great to have a report back on that. Some of it seems to have been successful in the sense that when those units are sold, the equity is retained, but the new units being purchased seem to be further and further down the valley, and that's because the market has changed so much. So, you know, I mean, you really want to start asking is, how far away should a police officer or an electric lineman or roads people be living? But again, I would see a parallel between those, especially if it's starting to go into free market use for a down payment assistance.
And this is based on the survey data noted, your feedback is noted, thank you.
Thank you.
Of things to further, areas to further explore as we work towards the next step, which is some form of bringing our internal key stakeholders for a day-long type workshop to work on our objectives, revisiting the philosophy, the program goals, developing a really specific multi-year work plan and whatnot. So this is the data that's going to help drive some of those decisions. I don't know where we'll end up, if we'll have a shared equity program or not. What we know now is the survey says 51% are interested.
Yeah. No, I
Yes,
think
can
it has some value.
Yes.
Go ahead, Skippy.
Sorry, I can't see you guys either. I don't know why it's like this today, so I apologize. I can't read where in the conversation is the place. But Sarah, I wanted to respond to your question too about seeing the connection, because I also see a connection between these two choices, and I have comments that are similar that I was going to hold for the next one. But to me, the connection is about the relationship between the citizen and, in this case, the employee and the community, and how it is or isn't affected by where we live. And yes, there's the direct effect, which is clear, which is transit time or transit frustration. But it's deeper than that. And, you know, I think the market economics are as such that we cannot responsibly say we want to, turn over every stone to solve this problem and not look at this. We have to look at this, and that's understandable and clear to me. But I will say I have a higher degree of skepticism in this area than others because of, what does a community look like where, the majority of its workers and what does a city look like who has, a significant portion or, many of its workers not really living in the city, that come in for a paycheck. Like we treat rental cars differently than we treat our own cars in general, on average, and not for everybody, but it's just true. And so the connection for me is being really mindful of that relationship. And, it will provide a significant thought point and barrier to me on these issues, but obviously not a hard line. Like you said, we've already purchased outside the urban growth boundary, but one unit is different than making it available to everyone. And, we kind of thought about this problem when we were like constructing Next Gen back in the day. It's like, well, on one hand, people living down Valley really maybe want to be up Valley, but if not, it's their place to play and recreate and work, but just not their place. So they obviously are stakeholders and are part of the community, but in a different way from people in Aspen. And in that case, there was a compromise of like the majority have to live and work in Aspen, but we still want to have the door open for that opportunity for obvious reasons. So I have no idea where I'm going to fall on that, but I just want to answer your question directly by that's the link that I see. And I do think it's a really, really important one, because having a community that's truly vested working in it, I think, is really important.
We hear you and agree with you, and that leads us to a reminder of our, so we're really talking about different pillars within our innovative solutions for the housing program. So we're looking at down payment shared equity, and we actually have, especially with the council approved Snowmass Village and Aspen Airport Business Center units, 67 units that are prioritized for essential and emergency public services through our city positions to provide those services, which is really in essence your emergency response officers, your police officers, to your point, your electric line technicians. So we currently have these priority guidelines for rental and ownership units that prioritize community services based on positions. And on occasion, we do look at recruitment and retention positions, critical recruitment and retention positions, along with agency director and department head positions. So this would be part of our strategic planning, is looking at the guidelines, assessing our current criteria, eligibility, the way the rental formula mirrors APSHA, and assessing our transitional housing unit policies and programs as well. Currently, we have 5 transitional housing units, so that's where an employee trying to land, a new hire potentially, or someone going through a life circumstance, such as a divorce, where their financial situation may have changed drastically, and they need a landing spot for a period of 6 months to a year, and we're able to work and provide that flexibility and benefit.
Lisa, it's going back one slide to the down payment assistance and shared equity. I think you mentioned that you'll be checking in with the county. I was talking with the county commissioners yesterday about this type of program and what they're doing, and didn't have time to go into as much depth as I want to. And maybe after the first of the year we'll have lunch, but just to coordinate with the county.
Thank
collaborate.
you. We use the same company for the program, for our down payment assistance and their shared equity. Many of us do within Eagle County and Glenwood Springs. So we will be looking at their data and information as we move forward.
And I would suggest to the councils, the staff, you've delegated the responsibility of this program fully to me to manage as your city manager. And where I view the council's role in this is setting your target of what percentage of our workforce you wish to offer a housing opportunity to. Some kind of housing support, whether that's units we own or rent, whether that's down payment assistance, whether that's shared equity. That's really where I view the council's role, is provide that visioning assistance to the staff. And it's our responsibility to go back and figure out what are the ways to accomplish that as part of this reiterative process. And it will come with financial asks. It always does every year. We have this conversation. But I would encourage you not to get too focused on this solution or that solution. It's going to be the solution that fits for that employee at that time, which will inevitably constantly change. It's just what we see in these recruitments and in these conversations. I was just on the phone with one of our officers this afternoon talking about his housing situation. Someone who started out as a single person with us who now has 3 dependents and a partner. And we have, how did that person make it through our program? And without our program, they wouldn't be part of our workforce. And so that's why we're going to have these different options throughout the people's life stages. Thank you.
I think what works most effectively is having the menu, the array of options, which allows innovation along with employee choice and flexibility, is what we've learned through the years. And it ebbs and flows.
I have some sensitivity too, and want to find the correct balance between the government and the public sector on, because we're using taxpayer dollars to house employees, and those taxpayer dollars aren't for housing isn't available to the private sector. I fully understand the retention and recruitment challenges we have at the city, and my first responsibility, I feel, is towards the city, but I want to be fair for the rest of the community as well. So that's a balance that I need I don't know where that is, but I want to be cognizant of that.
I appreciate that comment. And just for the benefit of the public who may be listening, let's talk about how this program's funded, because I don't think you have that in your slide deck, do you?
I do not.
Yeah, okay.
In the
So
memo.
how this program is funded, it is not funded with the money that creates the general community housing. So that's the 150 fund that builds Burlingame, builds the Lumberyard, builds Park Place partnerships. Completely separate revenue and accounting system for those community projects that are then managed by APSHA. These 67 units are funded through an overhead charge per full-time employee in any department. And so that charge, and I apologize, I don't remember it this year.
10,000.
10,000 this year, goes into the fund that administers these programs and acquires new ones. And at times, such as the 550 East Main project next to the police station, builds projects to create more housing. So just so we're clear for the community that there is a very clear reason we keep these programs separate and that we're not taking anything from the general community program in order to house city employees. Thank you.
And I appreciate that, and I'm aware of where the funding is coming from, but those funds that are transferred from the departments, those are funded through taxpayer dollars.
Absolutely. Just, I appreciate and know you understand it. We have members of the community who may not follow our finances that closely.
And I would also,
Board-
sorry, go ahead.
Skippy?
Sorry, I don't know if there's a way to be able to see you guys. I apologize. Not trying to be jarring, jumping in, but Ward, I really appreciate you saying that. I just wanted to add, because it's something I was thinking about a lot here as well. And yes, there will be specific instances where the public need for particular employees at particular times is just different than a private sector need. And we know our private sector is also in the toughest spot it's been. And so I think our opportunity is really to focus on solutions that can also lead by example, things that we would be excited to see our private sector take on for themselves as they step into the role of wanting to do more themselves. And when there are solutions that we would not want to see our private sector take on, just to make that explicit and explain why for transparency and trust.
Thank you. I wanted to add, and it's articulated in the memo as well, as Sarah mentioned, the majority of the fund is made up by the FTE charge, which is around 3.5 million of the 3.8 million, and also to recognize that there are rental fees collected along with housing sales and for the purchase of the unit.
Rachel?
Yeah, thank you. Again, I really appreciate that there's been a deep dive and we're working with our employees to identify preferences, and we'll continue that work going forward. I know that for any agency, whether it's RAFTA or the hospital or others that do provide some of their own units, I always encourage them to let their employees know about APSHA sales listing and get on Home Track. And people sometimes don't like the idea of an employer-controlled unit. Well, bid on the ones that aren't employer-controlled, and your obligation then is just to continue working in the community, not necessarily for any one employer. But I do think, when I was in the county, we asked that they send around the weekly APSHA listings to all employees as an all-county email every week, and try to get some people to think about taking a proactive stance. I think it is important that we look at the services the city provides and the functions it provides as a business. And so, yes, we're using some of the revenues that come into the city, and a lot of that's fees, actually, for services, not just all taxpayer dollars. And a lot of those sales tax dollars are from the guests who are helping to serve, but we have to provide the services that support all those activities. And so as a business, I fully support going forward with this sort of program. If you look at any of the newspaper stories from around the state, this is hitting everybody horribly. They're worried about the declining level of education in our public schools for lack of teachers. I was reading in Mesa County, just yesterday that their number of homeless students has gone up by 25% this year, and they now count over 807 homeless students in their school system, and they have teachers who are living in vans up on the Grand Mesa. And so this is everywhere. This isn't just Aspen, and it's just not the resort communities, pretty obviously. So we need to be very aggressive on this. I have two further comments. I think the city really should take a hard look at the 2 golf cart lots that were designated for affordable housing, that we need to track down whether it was for city employees, whether it was for general APTRA employees, whether we should sell those lots for free market homes, whether some neighbors and open space groups should buy them to keep the views pure. But those were designated for affordable housing when the city got the golf course. They're worth millions and millions of dollars, and something should be done with those. You know, to become a golf course and park amenity by subtracting it from the housing inventory without a $0 payment, I think is inappropriate. And I've brought that up before, whether it's finishing the lumberyard needing money, whether it's more affordable housing for city workers needing the money, that finding the roots of how we got that entirely, and then bringing it forward as a public question, I think is important. And I know a lot of people would love to see it open, and that's fine. And then it should be purchased with open space dollars. You know, the Housing Fund originally bought Bass Park when it became on the market, and then we later had the Open Space Fund buy it back out of the Housing Fund because it was inappropriate to hold it as open space when it was for housing. And I feel the same way about the golf course lots. Finally, I think that we need to really think about literally housing all of our employees, or pretty darn close to it. And it gets frustrating to me to think that we have different departments who are all paying the $10,000 an employee fee, but yet they may not be able to place any new employees or recruits in any units. And there are, as necessity dictates, going to essential workers at this point in time. But I think that that leaves the city saying, well, lower-end workers can fend for themselves somehow. I mean, that's the impression it gives when it's the more higher salary people who have units, or if we have any departments who've been paying in 10,000 employee or whatever the rate used to be every year, and yet not having any employees in their departments in these units. That concerns me.
So to clarify, thank you, with the housing guidelines, you do have electric line technicians, you have utility employees, police officers, and a large majority of our units, and you do have department head and agency head directors in the units too. It is fairly vast with the variety of departments that are in our current housing inventory when you look at the units too. So to clarify, there is a broader range, and we do have specific units such as the ARC and Parks units that are designated for our recreation and park staff.
Right, and we intentionally didn't bring you census information about who currently occupies these. The census information changes monthly with lease turnover. And so what I would suggest to you is that we have those priority systems, but we have certain units we specifically moved into a lottery system so that everybody in the organization who's a full-time has a shot, because before they didn't until we started that lottery system about 3 years ago, is it now? 2 to 3 years ago. And that's been really important. And as I look across the organization right now, I can only think of one department that does not have someone in our program. It might be 2 departments overall, but otherwise every department has at least some participation in the program. But we are prioritizing the water and electric and police officers first.
Yeah, as I said, I agree with needing to house those first, but I think as we go forward with our goal, it has got to be that, especially given what is coming out of the budgets of each department per employee, that we can create more and spread them around more. Thank you.
I just have a few more slides. So we've talked about this slide, I think, already with our 67 current units and looking at continuing to potentially expand it based on our strategic planning, our upcoming strategic planning in the first quarter of 2023 with our key internal stakeholders. So this gets into the next steps, which is really where we're at. We have immense data, continue to have more data, and we're looking at bringing our internal stakeholders together for a workshop, a full-day workshop to really spend time defining our objectives, our overarching philosophy, refining that, talking about where we go from here, if it's acquisition of built units or the development of employer housing units, the geographical location review, looking at our policies, reviewing the current down payment if we should expand it into a shared equity program as well, or in conjunction. We have quite a few areas. Transitional housing, reviewing that policy and program if we need to expand that. So there's a lot of information. It could be more than one day, potentially two, and then an iterative process thereafter for our planning. But frankly, in moving this forward and gathering the housing survey data, I think we had an aha moment of let's take a pause and really work towards the strategic planning and making sure that we're aligned as an organization and where we're heading, that we're prioritizing our work plan, and we have that refinement, if needed, of financial planning, and we're identifying our resources and leaving no rock unturned. So in summary, this is just a recap of our timeline. We're using the total compensation philosophy that was adopted by Council in the summer of 2021 as our foundation, our guideposts. We have the data from amongst a variety of data, the employee housing survey, which was deployed just over the summer. And then we did purchase 2 additional housing units approved by Council. And in the first quarter of 2023, we'll bring key internal stakeholders together to meet and develop our city draft employer-sponsored housing strategic plan. Any more questions?
Skippy, anything from you?
Thanks. I just wanted to second 2 of Rachel's points, one about the golf course lots. I'm in full agreement there. And secondly, the comment about 100% of employees as a target. Though I continue to kind of disagree with some of the underlying incentives around 150 versus 550 fund, and, agnostic of tool. And with the recognition that there may be some edge case scenarios where we'd prefer to have a telecommuting employee for some reason, for some, non-full-time subspecialty or something, I'd love to see every employee of the city living in town. So I just wanted to second and highlight both of those points.
Thank you.
Well, I think the housing is an integral part of the TCP, and the more we can do, the better. I think that the survey shows that not everybody wants to live in Aspen. So I think that we should be 100% of the employees coming from the 505 fund or a combination 505, 150. That might be a stretch, particularly some of the part-time employees there for parks in the summertime, but in the valley-wide survey also showed, again, a few years ago that not everybody wants to live in Aspen. So keep that in mind as well. But obviously, I hate that word obviously, it is apparent to, it seems as though everyone, that housing is the huge challenge, not just in the Roaring Fork Valley, but throughout the Mountain West and in the United States and the world. So what we can do to enhance the availability of housing for employees, I think really adds to employee retention, recruitment and satisfaction, and stress levels, decreases the stress levels.
Thank you.
Thanks for saying that, Ward. You're correct to point out the desirability of living in town, and I appreciate that.
And it goes back to the plethora of options is likely where we're headed. And thank you for saying TCP. Any other questions or comments?
Just happy that this is going forward. Housing is another one of our priorities, and I think housing the people that deliver the product that Aspen taxpayers pay for is important.
Thank you.
Yep, I was I talking to? I mean, every organization it's amazing these days how every organization is having to become a housing agency. They're, and just taking on so many more roles and responsibilities. The city of Aspen's been doing this for quite a while, but, you're taking steps forward. I look forward to the first quarter meeting next year and onward with TCP.
More to come.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Alyssa.
Thank you, Council.
Again, we are back to our agenda, but the next item that we're going to take is the fleet update.
Chevy Equinox EV, starting at 37. It's a good sized vehicle, 300-mile range. I'm kind of looking because my car got hit last week on the street. Something slid into it or whatever. But so I might be like. That's a good sized vehicle in range. I don't know if it's, I haven't checked to see the availability of it. I saw an ad for an Equinox EV with a 300-mile range starting at 37K.
Just so you're both aware, at the Board of Health meeting, Greg Poshman let me know that he was the proud owner of a brand-new Volkswagen electric car. And I gotta say, super sporty.
ID4, I'm told. If any of you guys have seen the new Hyundai Vision 74N concept, wildly impracticable, but we should maybe consider swapping everything to that because it's so cool.
I also saw a Cadillac EV that looked pretty hot too.
Everybody's doing it. I'm next in line.
Rifle Council
Ready to go? Yeah. All right.
isn't so sure on electric vehicles. Go ahead.
Electric Rock.
What's that?
Hey, next in line, Electric Ruckus, because that sounds like the best idea you've ever had.
Okay, good evening, Council. My name is Tim Cobbs, and I'm a Sustainability Program Administrator here with the City's Climate Action Office, and I'm here to provide you an update on fleet electrification and to introduce the Fleet Zero Emissions Roadmap.
Tim, it's really hard to hear you on the Zoom. I don't know if you're far from the microphone, but it's very quiet.
There you go, green.
Oh.
We're working now?
Oh, yeah.
Way better. Thank you.
Perfect. Okay, so the purpose of today's work session is to provide City Council with an update on internal planning document, Fleet Zero Emissions Roadmap, and to get approval of the direction of the roadmap to enable its implementation by staff. The purpose of today's work session is for me to not keep repeating that acronym as well, so I'm going to try to I'll use our roadmap from now on. Bye. So the agenda for today, we'll dive into some fleet electrification background. We'll look at the City of Aspen fleet. Then we'll look at the details of the Fleet Zero Emissions Roadmap, FZR, and we'll look at the process that got us here, and the opportunities and impact of the internal stakeholder recommendations and action items contained within the roadmap. And then we'll have time for questions for you and discussion as well. So to start us off, this work is all part of Council's carbon goal to reduce emissions and as part of our science-based targets to keep global heating below the 1.5 degree temperature threshold. We received Council direction on May 17th that provided us with the impetus to create a fleet electrification plan. And as part of that direction, we also signed on to Go EV City, which was a commitment to transition our fleet to 100% electric and zero emission vehicles by 2050. And so all of this work is part of that initiative. In the box here, you'll see Aspen's transportation-related emissions totals. You'll look at that through two lenses. We've got community greenhouse gas inventory, which is transportation and vehicles are responsible for 11% of the total of community-wide emissions, excluding aviation. And that second inventory looks at what the city currently owns or facilities that the city owns and controls, and fleet fuel use represents 24% of total emissions in 2020. To look at, here's a snapshot of where we are today. We've got 229 fleet assets across 19 different departments. If you look at that pie chart on the right, you can see that vehicles make up 51% of that total. Those are cars, passenger cars and shuttles and pickup trucks. Equipment like John Deere tractors, ride-on lawn mowers make up 27%. And then vehicles and equipment make up 22%, and those are specific, very roadworthy type. It's like a roadworthy piece of equipment, like a street sweeper or a other piece of heavy machinery make up 22% of that total. Included in this total, and most recently boosted by the Aspen Police Tesla's purchase of 5 Tesla Model Ys, which represents the largest electric vehicle purchase investment the city has made to date. We have a total of 11 battery electric vehicles and 3 plug-in electric hybrid vehicles. The lower emission vehicles currently within our inventory is 9 hybrid vehicles. Those are important in this transitionary phase for just general reliability, but will be phased out as we approach that 2050 goal as well. Finally, I just want to point out in that blue category, there is a huge opportunity to electrify vehicles in this particular sector. As you're all aware, there's a lot of models coming online right now, and the adoption S-curve really just spikes dramatically after 2025. However, just the importance of this work, the reason this work is geared towards preparation is that we know this is coming, and we are dealing with our own supply chain issues as well, but we want to make sure that the systems are in place to accommodate this huge influx of more electric vehicles that are going to be coming our way. That means improving policies and improving infrastructure to accommodate those in the long run. The development of this plan involved the following guiding principles. We wanted to create a process that looked to break down the barriers and challenges to greater electrification. That relied on really a strong collaboration and buy-in from departments across the city. And this also, we had early advice just to bring in a lot of flexibility as we approach these targets. And to that end, the departments on the right were all pivotal in the development of this plan. We had 25 department heads and staff over 16 different departments contribute to this plan over the course of 4 meetings and a lot of one-on-ones. So it's a massively collaborative effort, and I'm excited to share that further. The roadmap itself follows similar steps laid out by us, sister cities in Boulder, New York, and Seattle. And it assists staff to electrify the fleet on a timeline specified by climate action goals. As you can see in the packet, the roadmap consists of 6 topic areas followed by 31 recommendations, and those will all be aimed to be completed in the next several years. The recommendations contained in the plan are meant to be iterative and updated regularly. So, we will look at this as new technology becomes online, and it's important that we continue to revisit this process. And if there's any significant updates, of course, we'll bring it to council as well. So that brings us to what this roadmap can provide the city. It will fast-track adoption of electric and zero-emission vehicles. Highlights include an EV decision-making matrix, which will help us improve policy and procurement decisions within the city. Comprehensive fleet and facilities analysis, which will further our understanding of where we are currently, what capacity we have currently at the city to charge, and to manage the charge of additional vehicles. A fleet finance team can help optimize budget processes. Workforce is a really exciting development in this space where we know we want to be equipped with the skills and capacities to handle these vehicles. And then, of course, probably the most important aspect is improving EV literacy and education within the city and outside into the community. We have an opportunity to reduce greenhouse gas emissions like I described earlier, but beyond that, electric vehicles represent a really visible reminder of the city's commitment to and progress on the city's climate action goals. And we have an opportunity to reduce annual costs. This really comes to light in two ways. Despite the high upfront costs, EVs have longer lifetime operational cost savings. And by strategically addressing the barriers to electrification, we can help to mitigate the risk of new technologies. And finally, the city has an opportunity, a really exciting opportunity to lead by example and demonstrate leadership by circulating the lessons learned of this report and setting a strong example for the community to follow. There are just so many factors that are specific to Aspen, and I think that we can lead by example and help businesses and private organizations within the community support them to achieve their electrification goals. So with all that said, the staff recommendation is for council to support the direction of the Fleet Zero Emission Roadmap, and we have time for questions and discussion.
Skippy, since I can't see you and you can't see me, any questions or discussion from you?
I support the filler.
Thank you. Rachel?
Thank you for your work on this. I think identifying the challenges and the opportunities is a very important first step, and being able to work that into our fleet management. A couple of things have struck me. One is that there's going to need to be some really intensive training with our public works and fleet repair crew. You know, it sounds funny, but the county would always maintain GM vehicles only, so they only had to be trained and have parts for GM vehicles only. And when buses change systems from gas to natural gas or to electric, they've had to change and really retrofit in many ways some of the maintenance areas to be able to deal with those. So I see that as being just something, you know, we need to be prepared to service this fleet as it comes forward and keep it running less expensively than the others. So I want to make sure we're really looking into that. And then the second would just be maybe some wishful thinking on my part, but I do remember the old deal the city used to have with Saab, where they got a really great rate on the police cars, and Saab would advertise that Aspen uses Saab for these high wintry conditions, but only in Europe. They didn't advertise in the United States. So it wasn't much of a commercialization issue, but the city was able to maintain a pretty good fleet of some good cars. And I just wonder if any of those EV newer builders or rolling out with the electric trucks and the different type of service vehicles, might be able to see if they want to showcase their stuff here or anything like that. So, trying to see if there's a way to save money, but also save the planet at the same time.
There's a huge demand for these.
Everywhere.
Yeah, when we got the Teslas, there was no wiggle room there at all.
Yeah. Well, I was just thinking maybe some of these other vehicles that they want to show that the new electric street sweeper really works or things like that in the future. It might be worth exploring.
Everything's worth exploring, but I'm not real optimistic. I mean, when you have a year-long wait to buy one.
Yeah, I understand. Thank you.
John?
Yeah, I think this is great progress, and I'm proud to be on part of a city government that's pushing this. There was an article in CNN recently that talks about greening of ski areas, and Auden Schendler of the Aspen Ski Company is quoted extensively. But at any rate, there was this thing that really stood out to me. There's a lift company for Les Deux Alpes and Alpe d'Huez in France announced in January 2022. It's going to partner to convert 5 snowcat grooming machines and 3 buses into hydrogen, while Taos Ski Valley in New Mexico says it will be the first U.S. resort to introduce an all-electric grooming cat. So progress is being made, and as well as with lawn implements. leaf blowers and lawnmowers and so on, everything's we're changing very rapidly. So thanks for being at the forefront of this.
Sure.
Thank you.
Very good. I'm all on board.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, council. Next steps is to just incorporate this really, this great feedback and continue with the implementation of this plan. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tim and team.
Thanks, Gibby.
All right. We have another item on our agenda this evening.
Leave it.
Okay, I'll be back in a second.
Hey, Jessica, welcome home.
Hi, thank you.
Is that a Jessica Garrow? I can't see anyone in the room, but it sounded like maybe.
It is. Hey, Skippy.
Oh,
Or that's the Four
I owe you an
Seasons
email.
Taormina.
Yeah.
now I'm extra bummed I can't see anybody.
Mr. Mayor, is it okay if I share my screen?
Yes, sir.
What does that do? Okay. Thanks.
All right. Let's see here. Yeah, 37. That's a lot.
Should be gold.
Yeah.
That's,
How much do those start at? 20 something?
yeah, but there are incentives and rebates on them too. Tax credit.
One that loves theirs is Chris Lane.
A bolt?
Yeah, he's got a Chevy Bolt. He loves it.
Oh,
Yeah. My girlfriend has one out. Yeah. I'm gonna look though, because I don't want to buy another gas car. If I'm gonna get another car, I don't want to get another gas car.
Right.
I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna make the whole change.
yeah, there's some of them coming up. I was looking, we were looking at buying more Towner. And there's another one that's, what is now complete. Being sold in Colorado at that point. I'll get that information to you because it even came in a little bit higher rated than the Bolt, but the Bolt was highly regarded.
Yeah.
Okay.
The range isn't that good. Or wasn't. It wasn't. I think they're getting it better, making it better, but it wasn't.
Haven't they discontinued the Volt? And they're doing new Volt and doing new versions.
No, the Bolt is their EV, their total EV.
Okay, I thought I read something that they were, maybe it's a
Anyone else has
Leaf,
one, it's
maybe it's
Brad
a Leaf
Smith.
they've taken out of production.
That's
Used to
Nissan.
run the Red Onion.
He has an electric?
Yeah, he's got an electric car, and check it out. He parks it right behind CP Burger and skis. And then when he's done skiing, it's charged, and he's got a great parking place.
You guys ready?
Sure.
All right.
Mr. Mayor and Council, thank you for your time this evening. Ben Anderson from Community Development, joined at the table by Eric Krungold of Design Workshop, Jessica Garrow of Design Workshop, and Philip Sapino, Community Development Director. And we're here to talk about a couple of topics this evening, both of which are in some way related to the outcomes of the moratorium and the long process that we spent with council and the community this summer and going back into the spring and winter of last year. But these were two topics that emerged that we said that we would come back and have some further discussion with council as we were going through that discussion. The first are some possible improvements to the Affordable Housing Credits Program. And then the second is, and that's really the focus of the conversation this evening, but at the end of our conversation, we do have a presentation and a question for council related to waivers or reductions of affordable housing mitigation requirements for resident locals. This topic came up as we were changing the mitigation requirements for residential redevelopment. And we had some citizen members who are members of our citizenry who raised some questions about potentially changing the way that we deal with affordable housing mitigation for resident locals. This quote was in the staff memo, and before we get into any of the specifics of the conversation this evening, we wanted to just make sure that we were on the same page with council. You know, I think we, you know, at the staff level, see the Affordable Housing Credits Program as having done what it was designed to do, successfully encouraging private sector production of affordable housing units. During the moratorium and conversations post-moratorium that we've had with council, you know, I think that there's some shifting dynamics within the credits program and the credits market, and we understand the situation to be that council is unified in their desire to continue to improve and promote this program. But we did want to just ask the question if that assumption, before we get into any of the specifics, if that assumption is correct. Or do we need to have, you know, a higher level conversation about the credits program and its role within our larger affordable housing program, and even more specifically, council's affordable housing goals and our strategic, you know, housing plan. So with that, I just wanted to get a little bit of feedback on this, if there's general consensus from the five of you, if this assumption is correct. Go ahead, Rich.
Yeah. I'll try to take a stab at that question, and I noticed that you had put this comment in the memo, so I do have concerns about how much is the Affordable Housing Credit Program become now part of our growth driver. It seems that all the credit programs are about you know, it's almost become a burden onto the city to say, you have to make the housing credit program better so we can have more growth and they can mitigate their housing. And I thought about, well, what are potential solutions on that? And one would be, I think there should be a bare minimum of a ratio of on-site housing for any project to be able to use housing credits to mitigate the rest of their project. But when you think about our housing program as a whole, and if a project is housing somehow 60% of its workforce, the other 40% is not housed, and they're not going to be getting a housing credit unit, and we've just thrown 40% more demand onto the public sector side of things. So at what point are we becoming the engines of growth to say, you can build this, and we'll find a place for 20 affordable housing credits somewhere over here, and maybe we'll even pay for the land to help make it happen. And meanwhile, the other 40% of your employees will be on their own on the bus to rifle. You know, so that dilemma is not fixed. I mean, I really have thought this is an innovative program, and I appreciate the private sector developers who've brought projects to fruition. But at the same time, at what level are we catching up on the shortfall, or are we actually just continuing to create more shortfall? And knowing that 40% of any new project coming along is not going to have to house those employees, and we're making housing credits available to them to say, hey, we can do this, and not on site, we're limiting the land available for general housing, and we're not catching up on shortfall. So for me, a big goal of continuation and improvement of this program would be potential to tie it into growth management in some way, that it's not just the easy off-ramp for really large new developments, and it's not dumping 40% of the employees of those developments or redevelopments into the general APSHA shortfall pool. The other thing that we have talked about a little bit in the past is the city being able to buy housing credits. And if we were able to buy housing credits, they could go towards that shortfall and create more competition and potentially even raise prices for those developers who are selling them. But by us automatically standing back, I don't think there's any real equity in that. And I think that would be something to be able to buy housing credits using APSHA dollars and turn them into regular APSHA units and for the general lottery for the public.
Just to ask a clarifying question on that last point, by the city purchasing credits, Do you mean purchasing units
Yeah,
that were
I mean
built for the generation of credits?
Yeah.
Okay, understood. Thank you.
Yeah, just buying both the credit and the unit, I guess, is the best way to put it together. But I think that, there's that. And then the other thing that has been, to my mind, a real mistake is just being able to bank the credits for years. We extended vesting or whatever, but you have projects like Midland Park being taken off the market. Renters moved out, it's vacant 3 years later. Who or when will anybody be housed there? And, so I think there should be some, and it's a review I've asked for at a different level on other commercial projects, but, the system for keeping a permit alive through its vesting period by, I just pulled the excavation permit, so now I got another year, and now I just pulled the foundation permit, so I got another year after that, and this is just not an acceptable approach. It's kind of like waiting for Godot, and I understand that development will ebb and flow based on interest rates and demand and all sorts of other things. But when you've approved housing credit programs and they're sitting there unbuilt, and it's just taking inventory out of the market, it's taking building sites out of the market, and we're not seeing the result.
Yeah.
So those are the biggest concerns I have, and I'd like to add a little more surety to the process, to the community, that if a affordable housing credits program project is approved, that it's built in a timely fashion, and it's there. But, right now, credits to me have become a growth generator. And that's, we already see the reaction with the county. The housing is all Aspen's problem, and that we are creating that growth ourselves by saying we're going to make a program eligible for you. You can house your employees cheaper. You don't have to put them on site. And I want to see a really high ratio of things on site. To me, some of this stuff was really about when it was a historic building and you really couldn't retrofit or do the right employee mix there or things like that. So those are my main issues with it. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments at this time? Skippy, you can see the screen that's shared, right?
Yeah, I can see the screen share. I just can't see you guys. It's weird. Normally it shows me PIP, but it doesn't here. I'm very supportive of us moving forward to promote and improve the credits program. Rachel, I think your comments are well landed, but they're a critique of the broader housing program, not credits in particular, with the exception of the dichotomy between on-site versus in a separate area. But, as was pointed out in the memo, our whole affordable housing system at this point is based on the idea of growth or new projects. And I think that fundamentally does need to change. It's not going to be a light switch. It's going to be a slow dimmer over probably decades, to be realistic. But I agree, it's a problem and we need to solve it. Until we do solve it, however, I think the credits program improved and promoted in such a way where rather than us having to go tax or raise each dollar and build as it delivered by the private sector and their dollars is extremely helpful. So I think there's a lot in this packet that's really exciting, but I do view these changes and the program in general as temporal insofar as we can get to a truly development neutral or non-development housing program. And I do think we can and will get there. The last thing I would just offer just as a comment, Rachel, and I would agree that there is clearly benefit to having on-site housing. I mean, anyone who's worked in a hotel that does or doesn't have that knows what that looks like operationally. But we also have to recognize the trade-off of that, which is we're already in this wildly expensive commercial place, and the more square footage that is not used for commercial, the higher we artificially drive up the price of those services and goods.
Yeah. Skippy, I have to disagree with you on that. The more we make it easier to move your housing off-site, the more the commercial value exists in those buildings. And you're just basically raising the price of commercial activity. And maybe if things were required on site, the initial sales price to the new developer wouldn't be quite so high. But when you can say, oh, you're not going to have to house people on this site, you can build the whole thing as commercial and restaurants and this and that, and the city's going to provide potential land subsidies now for housing credit programs for new growth. I can't agree with that. And I don't agree with you when you said the whole housing program has been built on growth. It really hasn't. The housing credits program has been built on growth, but the rest of the program is not. And it's built and was started to try to catch up on the shortfall. So anything that makes shortfall worse, in my mind, is not good for us. And when we're sitting here saying we'll facilitate your development, we'll find ways to make it happen, and don't worry about putting people on site. They can commute from wherever they come from. That just leads to our additional problems in transportation and congestion. So I can't agree with you entirely on that. The city has become somewhat of a growth generator by telling people you can build 100% of the commercial or darn close to it on site, and we'll just find some other neighborhood to dump your housing into. And I don't think that that's appropriate.
Well, I certainly hear your
I also am
perspective, and
seeing
let's
this-
not get,
Yeah.
what's that?
But I'm also seeing this change in the program of employer-controlled units. It's becoming a company town. Employers are buying the units, they're renting it. They can say, you're dismissed at any point in time, and you just lost your housing. We've decided some other position is more valuable to fill. And that's a real change from what I perceived the Affordable Housing Credit Program to be about, was housing permanent community members and being able to offer rental as a stepping stone to people who would become permanent community members. But now we're basically saying the bigger employers who have big banks and can get loans, they can get housing, and that smaller individual businesses are really not going to be able to pay the price to get one person in to buy one housing credit. And that's perhaps especially true for businesses in existing buildings that did never mitigate it in the first place, other than if a sale occurred and a rent was paid or something like that. So I am concerned about how this is acted as a growth generator in our town. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. I mean, they're all legitimate concerns, and we got to be careful not to conflate the wrong thing with a different thing within here. But you know, whether you are developing commercial or residential, you're not mitigating at 100%. Part of that is because we haven't made that choice from a policy. Part of it, as Ward said, is 100% of people don't want to live here. And so the equation has been, we should, target the number that actually want to live here. I'd rather see that number higher, but that's true across all of our housing system. And until something is built and developed, we don't require housing. And so that's what I mean when I say it's all tied to growth and building. It is.
Thanks, Skibby. Ward?
Yeah, I don't want to get into the whole philosophical thing at this point. From a very high level, I do support the Affordable Housing Credits Program. I see two really high-level things. One is that its ability to house employees without the city paying for it. And the other side, that I'm not sure that we should limit to mitigation for growth. I know that that's where it was built on, the idea of supplying housing for mitigation for growth. I couldn't agree more about the on-site, but I don't want housing on-site, mitigating on-site. I want to go through and see what the staff recommendations are. I think contain some really interesting options, but for this foundational question, yeah, I support the Affordable Housing Credits Program, but I want to explore ways that we can take this public-private partnership to provide housing where the city doesn't have, the 150 or the 505 fund doesn't have to pay for everything. So any way that we can get the private sector involved in it to provide housing and hopefully not as mitigation for new projects. But I don't want to get too far into the trees at this point.
Do you hear the answer there? You've got some concerns, some suggestions even, but yes, at the foundational 60,000 foot level, yes, we are supportive and we want to see improvements.
Understood. And, in future discussions of this, we'll give more discussion to the topic that Councilmember Richards brought up. But, I do think that, just to give a little bit of color, I think that, since commercial and residential development was asked to provide mitigation within the growth management quota system chapter of the land use code, there have been choices granted to developments to how they provided their mitigation requirements. On-site has always been one of them. Fee and lieu has been one of them. Buy-down units. For a while, accessory dwelling units were a mechanism. We decided that wasn't, a fully useful policy within the city. But, I think from staff's view, I do think it's the credits program is seen as another choice in that list of mechanisms to provide for affordable housing. And right now it is perhaps the most expedient way to do that. But there are still other choices that are available in the marketplace. And then just to give a little bit of clarity, I think for the viewing public as well, because I've seen online comments around this. The property at Park and Park that has previously received approvals for an affordable housing credits program, that vesting period for that project has expired, and there are no approvals sitting on that project right now. No credits have been issued for that project, and for I think a variety of reasons, the property is in its current state. But just for the record, there are not any approved projects nor have any credits been issued for that project at this point. Just for some clarity.
Is there anything related to demolition of that as a fire hazard, or the building coming down, since there's nothing going to really happen there?
We had building inspectors in the property, I believe last year in 2021, to do a basic life safety review of the property. At that time, they did not see any condemnable conditions on the property. We obviously got access with the consent of the property owner. And at this time, we're not aware of any redevelopment proposals that are in the works for that property, be they a credits project or what would be allowed by the land use code, which would be a free market multifamily or sort of complex. And I would also just note that to date, discussions with the property owner have been around the relationship between the ability to create credits at that site and other development sites within the community in some of our commercial zones and potential redevelopment there. So at this time, it's my understanding that is sort of slated for affordable housing credits project in the future, but there's nothing in our queue right now to look at.
Thank you.
Okay, so with that, I think that high level concurrence that this is a program that has been successful in what it set out to do. Staff, with support of our consultant team, has looked at a variety of things that we can use to further support private sector affordable housing development. Just for context, and I use these numbers in the memo, something like 125 FTEs have been built to this point and completed. There's another 55 FTEs that have either are for approval or currently in review. But I think as we sort of all realize, there's this need that is becoming more acute. We're hearing more from employers. We're hearing more from the community at large that we need to be doing more. Council has given direction to try to, identify development neutral options in affordable housing development, and we really do continue to see the credits program as having real opportunity. The stack of items on the left of the screen kind of break down a project very roughly in a project's pro forma of the costs that are associated with developing property within Aspen, the revenue stream coming into a project, And I do think going back into conversations around private sector affordable housing development, I think we have been reluctant to acknowledge that if we are going to make affordable housing development attractive to the private sector, they've got to be ensured that return on investments are at least someplace in the ballpark of what they could do pursuing market rate projects.
Go right ahead.
Yeah, just quickly, Ben, because we're using the number on the memo that there's been 124 FTEs been created and housed, and there's additional ones in the bank. Just using the 124 number being 60% of the employees demanded by a project, that means that 82 new employees were left unhoused that we have to pick up with taxpayer dollars through APCHA. So let's just always keep that in mind, that it's just, if it's for existing growth, it's a net benefit. If it's not, it's creating more shortfall on the back end.
Yeah. And I do think that is, I agree with that assessment. And I would also say that, choices around that are different policy choices around, the kind of mitigation, or excuse me, the generation and mitigation of employees within the code. But I will say that regardless of the option that you're picking for mitigating your growth impacts on a project, those are other policy choices about what that project needs to mitigate at. So point made, point understood, and it's certainly part of the process. So these things have nothing to do with the Affordable Housing Credits Program, but I think that there are things that we've already made some moves, some of which during the moratorium response, some things internal to community development. For example, we've waived all planning fees for 100% affordable housing projects. We probably, might come back to council at some point and ask if you want us to deal with building permits in the same way for 100% projects as an additional incentive. But we've got some real success, I think, particularly around review process and outcome certainty for compliant projects and land use. One of the things I think there's a lot of opportunity to work with APCHA to make sure that the land use code and APCHA requirements are better aligned than they currently are. We continue to hear from one project to the next that there's some friction sometimes between unit sizes and the regulations that are sort of built into APCHA requirements. Sometimes those things can be obstacles from one project to the next. But the focus this evening of this conversation is really about improvements to the Certificates of Affordable Housing Credits Program. And this whole program and the idea behind this program is to bring money, additional revenues into a project's revenue stream that doesn't have to be provided by the public sector. And instead is provided by the private sector who needs to mitigate for their projects. Some other possibilities that I think are, other policy choices that we can sort of investigate. And one of these is talked about in the memo, but we're looking at clarity and flexibility in the relationship of units to employers. We've heard a lot about the desire for employers to get involved in the program in one way or another. And then also this question around, and we'll look at some numbers and some of Design Workshop's evaluation, but thinking about on top of the program, is there a need to do for projects that meet particular criteria, other sort of direct subsidies on top of the credits program? Again, certainly a policy choice in front of council. Okay, with that, I'm going to turn things over for the next slides to our Design Workshop team.
All right, thanks, Ben. So in terms of the work presented today, just high level, Design Workshop went through and did an analysis of the credits program. We started with a series of interviews, and Eric's going to run through in the next slide some of the themes that we heard from those interviews. But we thought it was really important to understand how are people currently viewing the credits program. We used some information from other conversations we've had in previous work with the city, and so these interviews really focused on employers and financial institutions. Those were some groups that we really hadn't heard from in the past relative to this specific question. From there, we did some analysis of case studies. What are some other communities doing? And I think has been already referenced. This is a pretty innovative program. There is not another like it in the country. Other communities are just tackling this issue in a different way. So we wanted to study that. I'll say some of that was maybe interesting, not incredibly relevant and information that we could take take and directly apply here, but staff has that information and is maybe more relevant for some of the internal city housing programs. In order to understand what could program changes look like, we developed some baseline financial models. We took 3 different properties, 3 different zone districts, and modeled that. We'll get into the details of that again in a next slide. And then using those interviews, the feedback that we've heard, we looked at what are some possible program changes, and then we modeled that to understand what would the impact to the return on investment. Again, to Ben's point, wanting to understand how can a credits project be something that feels viable for a developer, to do that instead of a single-family home or some other free market project. And so we'll go into some of those details there, but that is the basis of our scope.
So for our interviews, there were a handful of common themes that really emerged across all the conversations. This first one is more specific to our discussions with financial institutions, and that is that credits currently do not hold any guaranteed value, making it very difficult to secure institutional lending for a project. So if I'm a developer and I'd like to use a credit for a project and I go to a bank to secure a construction loan, there's no way for them to recognize the value of that credit. There's no minimum guarantee for that value. And there's no time horizon that that credit will be sold in. So they don't have any guaranteed repayment timeline. Because of this, they are unable to use that credit as collateral against a loan, and they're unable to issue debt onto a credits project. These next 2 are really more for employers. The first is that currently dormitory-style units are not eligible for credits. And for employers that employ a more seasonal workforce or a workforce that is in and out of rotation, dormitory-style units would fit this type of workers really well. Currently, these workers are residing in other units throughout the valley, throughout Aspen. They're occupying spaces that could be more appropriate for a full-time employee within the valley. Third, for employers that are looking to develop dormitory-style units or housing, there's a preference for them to really only house their employees, to not open it up to the more broadly to the public. And this becomes a challenge if they have a seasonal employee who doesn't have a 4-year work history, who wouldn't qualify for an APSHA unit under APSHA resident guidelines. They are unable to house that employee in a credits unit. And these last 2 are more broad themes that have come up across some other conversations we've had. And the first is the idea of exploring where credits projects are able to occur. Are they able to occur outside of the current growth boundary? Are there opportunities to develop affordable housing projects down valley at perhaps a lower cost? And finally, this opportunity to explore the issuance of credits for RO projects. As it stands today, they are not eligible for affordable housing credits.
So I just add that I think that the overall theme was just an interest in maybe a little bit more flexibility within the program, as well as a little bit more certainty, particularly from the financial institutions. And so that's sort of what we then took to try to test within some of these options.
Excuse me, Eric, you mentioned if an employer wanted to have a project only house their own employees, but you were saying that the 4-year, doesn't that only apply to purchase? For rentals, there's not a 4-year waiting period, is that correct?
That's true.
Yeah. And I think that the piece was, what we heard is just a concern that we want to develop housing for our employees. If we go through the credits process, are we opening ourselves up to some additional requirement? And so there's a little bit of an education piece that I think would be helpful, and we included that as a potential recommendation. But there's that real concern out there of maybe we just develop our own housing and we don't go through that credits process because of either specific requirements right now, or we might have something added on through that process. So that was sort of the concern there.
And I think additionally, I think it's an intersection with APSHA's deed restriction language. And I think some concern that, if an employer had, seasonal employees that they wanted to house in these units, the deed restriction language to some degree, doesn't support that or isn't clear in how it supports that. And so I think there's just some concern that, our requirement for issuing a certificate is that we're doing an APSHA deed restriction and we've got a certificate of occupancy on the project. And, I think employers who are thinking about making investments in housing their employees are concerned about that limitation of the current deed restriction with APSHA and how it might apply to their specific employee needs from one employer to the next. And so I think they're somewhat concerned, and I do agree with Jessica. I think it's to some degree an education, because I don't think it's as restrictive as perhaps the employers have a perception that it may be. The image on this screen is one of the projects that we have approved through HPC. It's ready to go. I know that they're working on towards building permit at 611 West Main, and it's going to be a really great project when it comes to fruition. But this is kind of the launch slide for there's 6 areas that we identified in the memo, policy options, and then also some suggested tactics within each of those options. And I think just to move the conversation along, I think we'll go through each of those and hold off on questions till the end. But if you have questions about any of these top tactics and what they mean or how they might work or why staff and the consultant team are thinking about these things, feel free to interrupt. First is this larger, I think, thing that we heard pretty regularly in the interviews of just bringing some additional flexibility into the development of diverse unit types. I've been dry all day. The first is that currently the credits program does not allow for resident occupied units. This was in the past a much more frequent type of unit that showed up in the Aspen affordable housing context. But it's really gone. No, I'll get through it. Sorry, I got a tickle. Excuse me.
Yeah, take a second.
Good. So I think there's some real interest, again, to make projects work, to provide housing for folks that are living and working here full time, and to give, again, another tool of flexibility within a project's pro forma. I think for a long time, we've got pretty clearly stated preferences, I think both from APSHA and the Land Use Code of categories 1 through 4. And I think there's some interest in flexibility beyond that. Eric mentioned this in his comments. Whether it be dormitory, I think in the sort of the world of whether it be student housing or employee housing, rather than dormitory as we think of people with bunk beds, I think a model that we don't really have a way to deal in the Land Use Code is something called co-housing, where you've got a kitchen and common area surrounded by individually leased rooms. Right now, the credits program couldn't be applied to a project that was in that configuration. And then lastly, the credit program really doesn't respond to seasonal housing opportunities for employers. It makes it difficult for us to understand, APSHA to understand exactly who's in those units. And so there was interest in the interviews around, again, in these kind of types of units, diverse unit types, diverse types of projects, to build in some additional flexibility into the program. Questions or comments about this?
Yeah, go right ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I have comments on all 3 type. I've pulled up the affordable housing 2022 income limits and asset limits. And for a 3-person household, category 4, they can have a $203,000 income. And category 5, they could have a $238,000 annual income. But there's no income limit on RO.
That's correct.
So you could be selling RO credits on our limited amount of land mass to people with an income of $1.5 million a year, and we'd be none the better. I mean, if the question was, can an RO unit be part of a mix to make a project work, that's one thing. But when we start talking about an all RO housing credits program, and I really, you know, it gets a little harder to know that you're really verifying the work requirements for someone with an income of $1.5 million a year or 800,000 or this or that. You know, is it really going to be used for the intended purpose?
Yeah.
So I really have concerns about going to income levels that high for an AH project and calling it affordable housing. So far, the city doesn't develop RO. The city hasn't, and it's just been part of a private sector AH pro forma where they were allowed. The second one on seasonal employee housing, I have a concern with the idea that so many of our seasonal workers in the past have worked a different job in the summer. It's not, it may be seasonal ski and summer trails, or seasonal ski and on the construction industries or things like this. And so it's more of a larger question for council and the formation and the direction of the community of what do we want to encourage. Seasonal housing is the definition of a transitional workforce and a constantly transit workforce that changes constantly. And, you know, to me, things that encourage infill affordable housing built within our community, within our urban growth boundary, should be about building permanent community as opposed to seasonal workforce needs. I think that's just, with our limited land mass, that's just an issue. We do have a co-housing project in town, and that was the Independence Place that was built. And they do have a community kitchen, although they all have individual kitchens as well. And I was very familiar with that. It was the first co-housing project. Jim Adamski was the Housing Authority Director. Jim would remember that name. And he brought the concept to town. And I do think they occasionally use the common kitchen, but everyone has a kitchen in their own place for being able to prepare their own meals as well. You're not dependent on the common kitchen. And in a co-housing situation, the ideal was that one neighbor would make dinner one night a week, and you would get to come home and have a made meal, and one night a week or one night a month would be your night to cook for the whole group. And that's where the common kitchen came from. But you also would have your own kitchen for preparing your own spaghetti when you don't want to have to dine with everyone else and clean up the dishes that they left in the sink or find out your food's been eaten by someone else and all these other wonderful things. So kind of going along with either seasonal or co-housing, when we developed the Burlingame seasonal housing, there was a lot of talk with the tenants, people who live in seasonal housing already. And the main thing that people really wanted was a door to close off and not have, you know, a bedroom with 2 beds and a kitchen, the living room area. They wanted a bedroom with 1 bed and a door to shut for safety and for noise and for sound and things like this. So at some level, I guess, for me, it would be about the design of those type of units, but we have fought against having this sort of dorm life, transient workforce, disposable, not connected to the community, and trying to attract that. And, you know, at the Truscott addition, the first Truscott addition behind the red roof, the ski company had come in with a plan that had large 3-story hexagon buildings with all dorm rooms around the side and 1 common kitchen in the center. And no one wanted to live like that, you know? I mean, anyone who's been here for 30 or 40 years can talk about some of the old dorms, and the names they had are really not printable, you know, type of things. And it just was never something that engendered community members. Let's say it that way. It was good for a party year. It was not good for anyone to be a community member. So given limited land mass, I'd rather find ways of making real housing units work and units that will be for community members going forward, not disposables. Thank you.
Thanks, Rachel. You want to?
Leave it up to
Do
your
you want
discretion.
comments on this stuff now? I was going to wait, but since Rachel made some, do you want other comments on this now, or should I wait till the end?
We'll wait for consensus till the end, but
Okay.
I would, if you have individual comments that are appropriate here, feel free.
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess I'll try to keep it relatively brief. I think these are all great elements and possible tactics. I mean, when I see these three, what I see is three very obvious areas of housing need that I've heard about from all over the place for a decade. And they are types of housing that, you know, as Rachel said, we don't want any one of these three to be all the housing. And I think without the appropriate attention and barriers, you could easily see how the opening to any of these three, or RO in particular, could yield a result in which all the housing delivered through this mechanism are RO, which is not the goal. But I think for a variety of obvious and less obvious reasons, these are three types of housing that the political decision-making architecture has really struggled to deliver, but are important as part of the overall mix. You know, RO, we're going to see more and more demand for as, you know, the RAFTA bus driver goes up to 100K, right? So 2 RAFTA bus drivers are getting close to the end of our categories, and we'll adjust those. But the reality is that the chasm between our upper categories and the free market has exploded in width. And unless we want to be in a community with 0 doctors, 0 lawyers, 0 professionals, we're going to need more of these units. Co and dorm style housing. You know, I lived in Club Commons my first year in Snowmass. That's as co-housing as it gets. And Rachel, you were dead on. By the end of that year, I never wanted to live in that again. But the intention is never to trap indentured servants in co-housing forever. It's to provide an initial landing space for necessary employees, high volume, low pay employees that are necessary to run various businesses. And it's not about retaining everyone, but it's a recognition that at least from my freshman year, while, you know, the larger percentage maybe didn't stick in town, almost all of us who did stick and are making a meaningful contribution, myself included, came from that. And so it's a temporal piece of the puzzle, and the same with seasonal. So I think these things all have their place. They need their guardrails, but I think it's actually a great net benefit to see the private sector putting their dollars forward to delivering things that the public sector has struggled to deliver as part of the overall kaleidoscope.
Thanks. I'll reserve my comments till later.
Okay. Okay. The second policy objective, again, primarily coming out of our interviews and, you know, long-held conversations between staff and members of the development community. But we all, I think, understand that the conversation about affordable housing and the nexus with employment is reaching a crescendo right now, and I think that we understand that it's a defining part of how this town is currently functioning and not functioning in some ways. And so out of our discussions, you know, we heard, and I think we've already kind of spoken to this, some clarity and flexibility in the relationship between units, deed restrictions, and employers. There's some items in APSHA's rules. There's some items in the land use code that don't quite align to give clarity to employers and folks engaging in credits projects and how they can sell to employers or how they can't sell to employers or the folks that are going to be in the units, how does the system kind of deal with that? So that's possible tactic number one. We've already heard some comments about that. And then secondly, one of the current restrictions in the code, and it was, you know, very, I think, consciously arrived at kind of at the origins of the program, is to remove current limitations on nonprofits and quasi-governmental organizations, either operating independently or in partnership with the private sector. And so, you know, for example, if Habitat for Humanity wanted to do a project in Aspen, they would currently be precluded from that. If a project was, you know, that the school district wanted to work with a private developer to do a project and get issued credits to the school district, that is currently precluded. And so there's some work that needs to be done around this to make sure that we're not crossing any, you know, legal thresholds. But that has been expressed pretty regularly as we're trying to find creative solutions for both private and public sector employees or employers who are trying to figure out this situation. And again, it's a possible response, again, to kind of stack some of the things that could happen within the credit program to generate additional units.
Can I make one comment here?
Yeah, go ahead.
Cool. This one was good. I was lucky enough to have a good amount of Philip's time to think through this, because this was the nonprofits, governments in partnership was something I hadn't thought of, and I love the creative thinking here. But yeah, it was kind of like what might I be missing here, since it was assiduously avoided the first time around. And the conversation we had is like, is this just as simple as this adds a valuable piece to a financial stack for organizations that we care about and want to succeed in delivering a resource and affordable housing the community wants and needs, while also filling a market function of adding stock in the form of credits to a market that's at deficit. And the kind of consensus position is like, yes, but as I thought about it more, the one potential future downside is too many credits in the market, devaluing the credit and thus kind of, cratering the market. And I just want to say that out loud, but also to recognize that that's like a very high class later problem that I don't think should necessarily influence our decision making now. But Rachel, to your point, it would be a very clear indicator or emergent symptom of an overheated development market that I think would be a good indicator for us if we start seeing too many credits on the market, to really put our foot on the gas of that transition to development neutral. So I think this is great and I support it now, but I just want to draw our awareness to this as a leading indicator to the need to really shift our mode.
Thanks, Gibby. Any other comments on this?
Yeah, I'm not sure this is a place to comment on this, but I encourage nonprofits and other and employers to be able to house their employees, give them the highest priority for APSHA qualified employees to live in a project that was developed with private money or perhaps some contribution from the city. I think that it's certainly something that the city does, and we just talked about the city as an employer employing its employees or housing its employees, and that contributes to a stable workforce and a sustainable economy. So if we can encourage private public partnerships in creating housing for individual employers, for qualified APSHA employees, and for nonprofits that anybody working for a nonprofit that's living in APSHA housing now and moves to an employer financed housing, that frees up unit in the APSHA housing. So anything that we can do really to create housing without the city having to pay for all of it, I'm really open to.
John?
Yeah, anything that prohibits Habitat for Humanity from operating here, I think I'd like to see those prohibitions removed. As I recall, the Basalt Vista was built on land donated by Basalt School District, so it could happen here. Thanks.
I'm with Ward on removing the current limitations on nonprofits and quasi-governmental organizations. I don't know if there was a fear that any of the larger nonprofits that have $60 million endowments might end up cornering the market, and that was a concern. But a lot of this relates to other things that you have talked about, and that is people needing the credits or wanting the units, kind of overpaying the original price just to, bidding wars of getting the housing. And, that may be okay, but I don't want to be subsidizing somebody else's building war, and so you have to make sure you're tracking where, when you say the city puts in, you're talking taxpayer dollars. And so how it ends up, it may be that a quasi-nonprofit is a project that would need an RO for a director who makes $400,000 a year or $250,000 a year. So, I can see having to take a look at that. And it's really hard for me to relate to the first bullet point without knowing what was the clarity and flexibility. Are people not wanting to give a 6-month lease, which we have a minimum 6-month lease requirement? Are they flexibility to the pro side of the employer and to the downside of the employee? So without having a list of possible requests for flexibility, I don't know what that really means.
Yeah. Certainly, if we came forward with a proposal on this, we would have that list very firmly established. But just kind of more broadly, I would say that it's around the deed restriction. It's around the kind of lease terms. It's around the maximum versus the minimum rent that an employer could charge. And we've heard from employers who want to invest in units, but they have questions about, is it okay if I charge a lower rent than what APSHA charges, because we see it as a way to recruit employees. And so I think it's not so much a particular policy. I think this larger question that employers have of, if I were to sort of engage in this program, what kind of things do I understand or don't understand that could have unintended consequences for me as I try to house my workforce.
And so a lot may be answered with a frequently answered questions type of handout, but other things, they may want changes in code and guidelines. And so again, I just really need to know what that is, because every time I go back to this program is about creating credits for new growth. It's not tied into existing growth. I mean, maybe there are people, a nonprofit, who would have the money to want to buy a unit, the credit and the unit, but unless they're building a new facility, they don't need to mitigate. And so this is just intimately tied in with all new growth, and 40% of that new growth being unhoused. And so given those things, I really need to know what it is where does the employee lose by our subsidies here,
Ben,
whether it's land or benefits.
If I can interject just another thought, because these are also very intertwined and complex topics. There are scenarios where, quite frequently, where a credit or a portion of a credit that was created by the development of a housing unit over here is going to mitigate employee generation, employee demand for something that would otherwise pay cash. A scale of development that maybe isn't a new building. It's not a new hotel. It's not a new commercial building. It's 250 square feet of a new single-family home that was there before and that home was there before and it was going to be there after, right? And so I just want to introduce that nuance to the framing around the relationship between growth or development and the credits program, because it's not that straight one-to-one dynamic all the time.
It can be for much smaller things. I appreciate that. Thank you, Philip.
Can I ask a question just to make sure I'm not misunderstanding you, Rachel?
Yeah.
When you're talking about leading off the 40%, I think that what I'm hearing is that you are talking about the mitigation rate. Is that all you're saying? Like, I mean, if we just adopted a code change that said all new development has to mitigate it 100%, does that solve what you're talking about, or am I misunderstanding your point?
I don't think that there's going to be an adoption of a 100% mitigation standard, Skippy, but yes, that would change things. And on site. I mean, there's a point at which folks are going to want to say, hey, let me mitigate my housing in Carbondale. It's only 45 miles away. Let me mitigate my housing here. And what my main point is that this is part of a growth cycle. It facilitates new growth, and 40% or 35% of that new growth goes unhoused.
Yeah, okay, I do understand you correctly. Thank you.
So that nexus between affordable or housing credits and housing mitigation for new growth, is that something that we can break, that we can use affordable housing in public-private developments for something other than mitigation for new growth?
That's what I'd like to see, try to noodle around ward, and I certainly engaging private sector developers to create housing, whether it's through the credit program or otherwise, and a healthy risk profit margin for them is something I'm entirely open up to. But this is a program that's, the engine is growth.
Okay. This one, several of these would be relatively easy code changes. Would change a few words here, add a paragraph here. I do think that this would be a fundamental change that we'd have to do some groundwork. It's been discussed previously this evening on another set of topics. But, I think we're coming to understand that the costs to develop in Aspen proper are making the credits program more and more difficult to find viable products or viable projects. And one of the things that we heard in our interviews and from the affordable housing developer community is, could we consider an alternative geographical boundary for projects that qualify for AH credit issuance? And one of the things that's been floated out there is, rather than it being our urban growth boundary, which essentially goes up to the airport and the AABC, as possibilities. The urban growth boundary goes into other areas of town that are probably not viable for, any kind of density with affordable housing. But the reason for the suggestion on the Aspen School District boundary, there's the two geographies are up there, and I'm sorry that the upper map isn't a little bit more clear, but we've got the urban growth boundary in orange and the city of Aspen city limits in red. That map's from Map Aspen, but the map on the bottom is the boundaries of the Aspen School District. And it's been suggested, again, I don't know that staff is as clearly supportive of this as we are of some of the other things, but I think it's an interesting idea of that giving developers the opportunity to look for pieces of property in other jurisdictions, and just to be as square as we can, in picking county outside of the urban growth boundary, perhaps along the I-82 corridor, and then also Snowmass Village, where we've recently bought a unit, and where, while costs are prohibitive there as well, they're a little bit less there. And the suggestion here is not that we would impose any kind of development rules on these other jurisdictions. The projects would have to be fully conforming with those other jurisdictions. It's just that we would recognize the kind of interrelatedness of housing demand in the Upper Valley and give, again, developers some additional flexibility about where projects could be located. Certainly, this would require extensive conversations with our fellow jurisdictions to understand our intentions. I don't think it's changing ultimately the kinds of projects that their land use codes would approve or not approve, but it's just an acknowledgement that we are again throwing an additional potential revenue stream at projects that might otherwise not get developed.
Yeah, I support this, but I would want some more detail that a project has to be close to a main transportation corridor.
Can I
Rachel, do you have
jump in on
comment?
this one as well?
Yeah, go ahead, Skippy.
Cool. I appreciate this. Like I said in the last combo, I don't know, Ben, if you were in the room for that. I think we have to look at this, but while I'm not a no way never on this or otherwise, I would make this the absolute last thing that I do, for the simple reason that I think long-term health of the community is going to be served by people living close. Like, we want more Tories, right? Like people living in or near downtown. And I think a huge potential benefit of the credits program is going to be, if we get this kind of capital equation right, the cessation and reversal of the trend of naturally affordable lived-in housing turning into STR, turning into vacant second home, reversing from vacant second home back into lived-in multifamily RO and or category housing. And so I want to work with the development community with the assumption that we are, in town and in the urban growth boundary to understand those unit economics and development economics. And at that point, we may look at those numbers and say those are so wild and crazy that we simply have to look outside. But I don't want to develop this model with the expectation of cheaper land outside, because we simply won't know where to aim it properly. So I would say last, if at all, for me on this one. The one notable maybe tweak that could open this a little bit is thinking about a proximity exception, right? So if you are the fire station in Woody Creek, for instance, and you want to build your own affordable housing, maybe it's allowed to be outside the urban growth boundary if it's within a particular proximity of the workplace. I haven't thought through that in great detail, but that strikes me as one potential exception that could make sense.
Thank you. Rachel?
Yes, thank you. I think we all know there's involved commuting, transportation, and congestion issues as you get further and further out, whether it's the distance to the bus stop or whether it's the distance to your job once you get to town. So that's a concern. As I look at this, I think what's really missing for all of us is the definition of an urban growth boundary and what an urban growth boundary is supposed to do and why Aspen and Pickens County adopted an urban growth boundary. It's supposed to make it harder to develop outside, so you develop inside where it's appropriate. And we're finally just kind of seeing it tighten up. And this is the time to say, hey, let's bust the urban growth boundary. I mean, there's a lot of businesses that would love to move outside the urban growth boundary and have a nice, big, huge, modern city market over at Brush Creek Intercept Lot, or to have affordable restaurants for locals to eat at somewhere outside the urban growth boundary, because we just can't do it inside anymore. That, Portland, all those places that have urban growth boundaries, yes, it makes it hard to develop in town. And all this would do is drive up the value of the commercial redevelopment real estate in town, because it's now less expensive. You can buy an affordable housing credit program 20 miles outside of town, do all your mitigation, and I'm going to ask an extra $5 million for the property, because they lowered the mitigation requirement. That's an effectively lowering the cost of the mitigation requirement so that the commercial property can sell for more to the next developer. These things are all connected. They go around in a circle. People have always said, why don't you drop all your mitigation requirements and then the market will respond with affordable housing for the real people here. And it doesn't happen. The market rises to whatever level it can with as little development, mitigation, or impact as necessary. So I see this conversation as saying, let's bust the urban growth boundary for everything. For everything. Why just housing? We have a lot of things that we can't fit in the city anymore because it's too expensive. But if we maintain the urban growth boundary, we will find a way, and people will find a way, and the dynamics and the dollars will respond to the rules. But if we change the rules, the dollars and the dynamics will follow it as well, and it's just going to equal windfall profits. Thank you.
Thanks.
I would say of any of the six, this is perhaps the most important, and that we hear anytime we turn and listen to the affordable housing development community, folks that are thinking about it, either local developers or outside. This is the piece, and we've talked a little bit about it previously, that I think is most difficult to the program. And so I think that, as we think about this would be the one that I think would require the most work to get right. But I think the basic idea is that we use some city financial resources to guarantee some portion of the credit value of an AH credit. And this is either through a purchase that has been previously talked about this evening, of purchasing credits in the market and having a guaranteed purchaser out in the marketplace so that a bank and a developer had some confidence that they could sell their credits and have revenue coming into their projects pro forma on a reliable schedule and in a reliable amount. And I do think that this would require us to think very closely about our whole range and suite of priorities within our affordable housing program, the use of the 150 fund, and other potential revenue sources, because it's not going to be free. It's going to be money, real money. It's not, we've had some proposals for affordable housing program projects that are a little bit larger than normal, but probably, pursuing like $15 to $18 million worth of credit value for that project. And so, likely with everything else that we're trying to do with the 150 fund, we just can't write checks for $15 million out of the 150 fund. But perhaps there's a mechanism through which the credit can get involved in the market in a more deliberate way and find some mechanism to give some guaranteed value to these credits for financial institutions. In our view, I think it's probably the most important thing on this list, and also the one that I think is going to really require some internal work if we're going to pursue something like that across city departments. And then the second piece, a little bit less important than the first piece, is creating an alternative timeline for the issuance of AH credits in a project's development process. Right now, we have a phased approach that allows, a portion of an approved credits project to be issued, at various stages in the construction of a project. There's some suggestion that if we, bonded the project or got a completion bond or something like this, that maybe it's not a bad idea to issue all the credits before a shovel goes into the dirt, with the correct assurances that the project's actually going to get built. So, again, both of these, super important. Both of these, the word guardrails have been, the word's been used several times this evening. This, I think, is very important and also would need a lot of work across city agencies to think about, and we would need some very important guardrails on both of these topics.
Comment now, or?
I've always been under the impression that a government body cannot financially support individual businesses. And given that the housing credit program is based on new growth and development, and if we were putting financial resources that stayed, that weren't just a guarantee and then came back to us, that stayed, we would effectively be subsidizing a private business. And I don't think you can do that with taxpayer dollars. And you can't create winners and losers in the marketplace like that. It's one or two steps removed, but it's clearly that the public dollars are why that developer can buy those units at that price to build the rest of their hotel. And I think that would cross some governmental lines. So that concerns me. Looking to an alternative timeline, I can certainly want to investigate that, but I certainly don't want to end up with a Midland Park place when we've guaranteed credits. A developer has disappeared or gone bankrupt, and the price to develop the project he thought he could develop is now doubled or whatever. I think you could end up in some real sticky situations there. But if it's thoughtfully put out and there's perhaps enough other security put up to the city by that developer, even if it's not security a bank would accept, something like that might be a way that you could work with being sure that we're not issuing credits that are sold that then aren't fulfilled. And that's going to be the real challenge, is not having the city end up in a fraud situation or some sort of legal challenge that draws on for years. Again, for me, and as we're getting closer to closing this out, I'm more open to using financial resources to guarantee AH project that perhaps existing businesses in existing buildings want to buy into. And no, I'm not doing a new major development, but I need employees, and my international corporation is willing to pay for a few of those. That would be okay for me. That starts to be mitigating existing growth. But that credit would have to be extinguished as well. It can't be, well, I bought the unit now for my employees, but I can still sell the credit for some other new growth. Maybe there's a discounted price there. Maybe it's when an employer is trying to mitigate for existing growth, putting city dollars in makes sense. And that, because you're gaining on the shortfall. So, just keep that in mind for me. Gaining on the shortfall is a big part of when you start putting public money in.
Yeah.
Not subsidizing new shortfall.
Excuse me, Rachel, I just wanted some clarity when you mentioned about the Park Place. Were you talking about the?
Well, Midland, yeah, the one that's undeveloped that was bought, Michael Warner's old, or John Warner's old property.
Yeah, there were no credits ever issued for that.
I understand that, but
What?
Yeah, she knows.
I know that. I'm just saying that that's an example of I don't want to,
That if we-
as we're
that if-
changing this,
that if
and
we-
they could get issuance of their credits earlier in the development process. I just don't want a project half-built, developers gone bankrupt, credits are already sold, that for some reason it doesn't occur. It's not an apples-to-apples comparison, but it's an example.
Yeah, I don't know how we do this, but the issuance of credits would have to be, after there's a building permit and some construction, phasing along the way. And obviously, you don't give, unless you're looking at some way to put a value on a credit before it's ever built so that they can finance it. And I think that's part of the problem you're trying to, and if I'm not sure how you can do that.
Well, that's why I was just
Vaporware.
offering some insights and some
Give credit.
cautions.
Exactly.
Give credit where credit's due.
It's always been on CO.
I think that's the point that Ben and Philip were making, which I think is exactly right. Like the developer is looking for that capital to go to work earlier to make the project work, but we don't want to release any capital without having the deliverable. And so if we're going to be looking at how can we release that earlier, then there has to be very strict bonding or some other tool so that if something goes sideways, money isn't out the door for something that we never got.
Again, this tethering of the credits to mitigation is something I think I really would support untethering them so that, but the idea of, we're going to guarantee it's worth a Category 5 3-bedroom for sale unit, and then a financial institution issues credit, like you said, the developer goes away, and the financial institution comes to the city for the value of that Category 4 2-bedroom.
Yeah, they've acknowledged that there's a lot of tricks on this one, and I think we're all just putting out our cautions. Nobody has a real clear path. That's going to be up to Pete to figure out.
Good luck, Pete.
Thanks
But
for
yeah, I'd be open to
volunteering.
looking at, are there ways with the right safeguards to do that?
Yeah. Okay. I think staff also thinks that this has a lot of potential, and it's a whole suite of responses that we currently don't have flexibility to apply to different situations. But essentially, we want to see if there's possibility for seeing this as an incentive for actions within the larger affordable housing program that the program really never contemplated in its inception. It really had a particular type of development project in mind when the credits program was contemplated and built. And so as we look across the landscape right now, we have this very clearly stated desire to respond to the expiring deed restriction situation. We have some developers who are thinking about redevelopment projects of some of these properties that, if there is a credit component to their redevelopment, that they can, continue having units that we previously haven't issued affordable housing credits to, like dorms and co-housing types of configurations, that this might be a tool that we could utilize as an incentive within the expiring deed restriction topic. And it would require, a project-by-project evaluation for what would be necessary to get a developer to kind of agree to making deed restrictions go forward in perpetuity. But we think it's on some projects that are in this state where we've got some uncertainty about the permanence of their deed restriction. We think that this was perhaps a tool that could be utilized to give some incentive to bring those into perpetuity. We also see there's some increased flexibility that could be possible in the issuance of age credits in pursuit of other development neutral outcomes. We've had some real success recently at 1235 East Cooper with the credits program of providing 8 new 2-bedroom units to the school district to house teachers. And there were some challenges in doing that in terms of the way it intersected, again, between APSHA and the land use code. But we think that there's some opportunity there that could make that more viable going forward. And then lastly, APSHA's having conversations about their right-sizing efforts. We have heard from the developer community and others in the community that there's a concern that because of what's happening in our own free market rate kind of housing market in Aspen, but more importantly, what's happening down valley, if you are in an ownership unit, in a category unit, you're kind of stuck there because there's not an affordable place down valley that's in the market that'd be a kind of a step up in terms of your housing choice, and there's certainly increasingly little within the Aspen market. And so there's been some suggestion that encouraging mobility out of category units into RO units could again be another use of the credits program as an incentive. That one is a little bit more nuanced. We'd have to give a lot of thought to how that might work, but again, we've heard it mentioned by several folks in the development community, and we think there's opportunities across these 3 things to make a move. I think what, as council has talked about this idea of development neutral, kind of affordable housing development, using the credits program within that larger concept, I think is what we're talking about here.
Fascinating. Comments?
Yeah, really appreciate you guys bringing us big ideas. And I can tell you've looked at this from all different angles and everything like that. And so some of these may pan out, some may be dead ends. So for all, I think there's a little more devil in the details. But I don't know if you guys have gotten the memo of the APSHA right-sizing that just recently came out with the policy analyst. And it was interesting because a little bit of my gut instinct was borne out that it's older homes that were not required to have a deed restriction occupancy when they were brought into the program. So whether it was the North 40, people built their own size homes, whether it was Aspen Village, Lazy Glen, Woody Creek, all these mobile homes, they were already there and they were brought into the program, but they didn't have an occupancy requirement, and they won't until it's resold. But it really kind of pointed out some of the challenges within the program that way and the whole right-sizing thing. So I think a lot more work would really be needed in APSHA to deal with this. There's a mental picture I think people often get that, oh, it's seniors. But it can be a divorce. It can be all sorts of other circumstances that lead to an empty bedroom in an existing unit. So to the extent you're talking about right-sizing efforts to encourage, I don't know if it's about encouraging upward mobility to RO units or it's about encouraging lower income, because as people's incomes get lower when they're retired or when they're older or they're not working as much. But if it really was, designed to be more the move to place and designed for that purpose, as opposed to, okay, we're going to build some housing credit units and maybe some right-sizing people will take advantage of it, or, they have the first go or something. That, it would have to be so deliberate to, we've used that term, a move to place. And that's not just any other place. And so for seniors, it may really be first level and ground floor and flat, not a multi-story. It might be something different, but so that's where I would be concerned. The other concern I have with RO units in general is that they often are really just the tool to cash out a existing free market resident where somebody has lived, because you can cash out and there's no asset limitation, there's no income limitation. So RO units, actually, when they were first formed back in the day, were thought of as this is how we can keep our seniors who are getting to be cash poor and house rich, and they will sell their houses and move into RO units. Not high-end RO units or smaller RO units, but, so you have to think about what do you really want the ROs to do for you if we're going to be talking about ROs. So maybe there is some move up to an RO when you're cashing out a free market home, but for most of the people in deed restricted, it's not so much moving up to an RO, in the move out place. Maybe some of the category 5s have done better, but.
No, I think those are all valid points, and I think it's a response within the development community when they see, I think they're all sort of pursuing things that are unmet needs, and so we've heard that because of what incomes are in Aspen, both in public sector and private sector, because of what's happening in down valley real estate prices, that there is a desire for folks that came into the program as a category 3, category 4, and they've lived there for 10. They lived there for 10 years, and they've got a very different financial situation than when they came into the program.
And again, I'm saying I think this could be good, but it's really so much work will have to go in with APSHA to make sure it's really getting people moving out of their APSHA units and into these, and not out of free market and into these, and abandoning existing residences to become vacant residences. I didn't bring it in, but I did pick up a real estate sales book while I was on the road, and they were advertising the new homes in Rifle, Colorado, or no, it was Silt, I think, for $565,000. This is really wonderful opportunities for so many people. So we do have people trapped in their units who would gladly move to something else or somewhere else and it was less expensive than what they're having now. So I'd like to look at all those things, but AH credits for responding to deed restrictions, that is something that you really need to be able to compare multiple development scenarios with these people interested in redeveloping, and how would our demolition replacement ordinance play into that, and what they would have to do as opposed to if they cash out with credits. I mean, again, I want to avoid windfalls for anyone. I want a good solid bottom line is fair, but to create a windfall because, you got the puppy, with the gun, and we're going to lose all this housing in 21 plus years, I'm not so sure how many credits I'm giving away on that. Thank you.
Rachel, I just want to agree with you on what you're talking about. I read the right sizing piece and kind of scratched my head of like, I don't even know what that would look like, but I'm glad someone's considering it. And I think what you described, I'm in agreement with, right? The primary vector of movement we'd like to see, or utility for the RO, should be people graduating up from the credits program, not cashing out forever on a free market unit that will never be really used by community again to move down into RO. So I totally agree with that vector as a sort of policy direction for this inquiry. And I will just say, there may also be an opportunity for someone who is cash poor, house rich, who's been here a long time in the free market, who traditionally would just get to a point, sell and leave the community to get that windfall, but they don't really want to, maybe to get a credit or some portion of a credit in exchange for taking their free market unit to RO now. So that way they can kind of get some cash out of that unit to stay in the community as opposed to leaving. And the community gets, whenever they're no longer with us, that unit affordable in perpetuity, even if it isn't, restricted to the same degree.
Yeah. That's really creative, Skippy.
I can envision a free market migration to an RO, if it's part of a buy-down, to make that free market not sell at full market value, but a value that would be affordable for some kind of other APSHA use or APSHA qualified use.
Okay. And I'm going to have Eric talk a little bit briefly after this slide about the analysis that Design Workshop did. But I think as has been correctly identified this evening, this is really about stacking or layering a bunch of different tactics in a flexible way from project to project. You know, and again, we haven't landed on exactly what this list is going to be, but it's going to be a layering of things that we're, I think, proposing. And some of the work that Eric has done is showing that in spite of all of that stacking and all of that layering, that it still is a challenge for these projects to be competitive with market rate development and having the same kind of returns on investments for most of the properties that we see across town. But we do think that, you know, we're making a dent through these other policies, and I think the question is, and I think Rachel made some really good comments about sort of picking winners and losers and direct dollars into the hands of, you know, developers. But I think if something like this were to transpire, I think it's an RFP process, or it's a very clear direction about the kinds of units that we're looking for, on the kind of schedule, on the kind of, you know, with the kinds of residents that we're looking for, you know, category or otherwise. But I think as Eric's going to talk about in just a second, you know, I think that there's still a delta in the pro formas on these projects, in spite of this, you know, what would be a new set of techniques and tactics and incentives that we might build into this credits program. There's still a delta to overcome. And it makes sense for employers, maybe. It makes sense for folks that are developing for commercial projects that need to mitigate. But for a private sector developer to just go out into the marketplace and do one of these things independently is becoming increasingly difficult. And we talked a little bit more about that in detail in the memo. But the idea here is a direct subsidy above the credits program from, you know, we'd need to identify a revenue source. And secondly, and I think to Rachel's point earlier, I think along with this would be something like an RFP process, that if someone wanted to sort of pursue a project that tapped into these kinds of funds, that there would be a very clear set of expectations from the city, and it would be an open process where people would bid for it. But I'm going to turn things over to Eric just to talk, you know, briefly about the work that they did and thinking about, you know, actual pieces of property in Aspen in different zone districts, building a variety of scales of affordable housing projects on these properties. There's some challenges.
Thanks, Ben. So as Ben mentioned, we developed a series of financial models to test various development scenarios. And as we typically do, we look to base these as much in reality as possible. So we actually identify pieces of property within Aspen that exist today. They have set density and dimensional requirements. We determine a sales price for those properties based on a comparable development. And we look to test the viability of some of these different options that we have on the table. So we tested properties in 3 zone districts, R15, RMF, and AHPD, and we worked with staff to identify these particular properties. Some assumptions were made on these models to try to get them to be as apples to apples as possible, and that's to our benefit to just try to have a constant baseline. But one flip side of that is we don't get the option to test some different variability, and I'll talk about that here in a bit. But for our assumptions, we would assume that these would be APSHA qualified buyers. The prices would be set at APSHA. These would be for sale units set at APSHA rates. Based on direction from staff, we prioritized category 3 2-bedroom units. We assumed that the credit value on the market would match cash in lieu amount by category. We worked with staff to calculate a per square foot construction cost for these particular units. Next slide, please. So development in Aspen is challenging, to say the least. And that's really driven by two main things when we're looking at affordable housing. It's APSHA unit sizes are typically larger than what would typically be built on the free market, and APSHA sale prices are significantly lower than what you could achieve on the free market. To Ben's point, when we test these different options on their own, whether it be issuing cash for an RO credit, whether it be doing a project outside of Aspen, the urban growth boundary, providing a direct financial subsidy for infrastructure or some other component of the development, we don't see the needle move a tremendous amount. It's really hard for one specific policy approach or other approach to move the needle and make a profitable project. What we did do is started to layer these. We will continue to work with staff over the coming weeks to tweak these numbers and look at different options and test different unit combinations and category combinations. But when you start to layer these different policy options, that's when you start to see some benefit and start to see some of these projects actually cash flow and produce profitable development. But again, because of the development dynamics in Aspen, rising construction costs, land costs, on their own, one specific approach may not yield a very positive outcome financial outcome for development.
The other thing.
Can I ask a question?
Go ahead.
Yes.
Sorry, I'm not entirely understanding this slide. What is a vacated unit credit?
So that was one option that we tested that looked at if a developer was developing an RO unit and the occupant of that RO unit was vacating a category unit, they would essentially receive credit for both the higher category unit that they were developing, this would be if they were developing like a category 5 unit and then a resident was vacating a lower category unit, they would essentially receive credits for 2 units. They'd receive the credit for the construction of the new unit and credit for the vacation of the lower category unit or some fraction of a credit to try to encourage that upward mobility.
So just so I understand, so this vacated unit is sort of a mythical creature that we've invented and ascribed some value to. That's not in our code somewhere that I don't understand. And how did we set that value?
This is brand new. This is to Rachel's point, thinking big, thinking about what are the different machinations of changes to the credit program. So this was one way for us to model the financial impact of creating this ability to move within the program.
It's really just the name they created, Skippy, vacated units. You could call it move to credits or something like that. But it really is kind of a 2-for-1. You're offering
it's a credit plus. There's like the original credit that's implied plus this additional because they've freed up another unit. Yeah. Okay.
Exactly.
Got it. Okay. I just wanted to make sure I understood these, and I understand some of them.
Apologies for the confusion, Skippy.
You don't have to apologize for my confusion.
No, but just for everybody's edification, I mean, these are all some variation of the things that we just talked about in the 6 policy objectives, kind of layered on top of each other and put into a hypothetical pro forma for a project.
Right. So I would just add that this, kind of going back to the assumption slide, we made some assumptions that you don't already own the land, right? You're buying the land, and so that's included as part of your cost. So if someone already owned property, maybe they own it outright, and they wanted to move forward, that changes the financial feasibility of some of these. If you change the category of those units from a category 3 to a mix of maybe 3, 4, and 5, that changes the financial feasibility. So this is a snapshot, if you will, and I think that the message that we have as we went through and analyzed this is that there is no one thing that can change in the credits program to make it always financially feasible for someone to move forward. It is pretty site-specific, and it's really sort of an all-of-the-above approach. We found that kind of this idea of allowing credits for projects outside of Aspen is maybe the least viable. maybe it's part of the mix, but because construction costs and land costs are still so similar within the Aspen School District boundary, it didn't really move the needle so much. And so as council has those policy conversations about, do you even want to consider that, just kind of keep that in mind. It was one that, again, didn't move the needle as much as some of the others.
The positive side of the boundaries is availability of property. It may not move the needle on the cost, but is there some place that could be purchased where a development could be landed?
I think that's a great point. For this case, where we looked at existing properties, so we looked at comparable sale prices for similar units that we were testing in Aspen if we were to develop the same type of unit in, for instance, Snowmass, and it didn't move the needle based on existing property, but I think that's a very valid point. If it was just vacant land, I think that certainly would impact it.
Rachel and John?
Yeah, a couple of things. When we talk about vacated units, I think it's creative to have looked at it, and it's somewhat similar to people saying, well, Apsha City should start just paying people to move out. And, you know, if we pay you $100,000 a bedroom to get out of the program and get out of the valley, we have freed up 2 units. No, we heard that during our board interviews from candidates, that that's what we should do. So I just, in that instance, I've asked, well, how long are you freeing that unit up for? Maybe it's, or that 3-bedroom is sold to someone with 2 17-year-olds who are going to go to college and they're going to be empty bedrooms in a year. Or maybe you've just sold that unit that you just paid to free up to someone who's going to retire in 10 years. You know, so what is the real merit? And so when you're offering 2-to-1 credits for someone to move out of a unit, again, that unit could just very well have been sold to someone who's getting ready to retire in 10 years, and you're not getting the real value of a new unit. And it can be a bit of double counting. I mean, what if that person wants to then move out in 10 years and get a housing 2-for-1 credit because they moved out? You know, I mean, it just, I think that's kind of creating more problems than it might solve that way. You know, when you talk about dormitory credits, I think you're really going to get into a lot of minutia there as well about how much square footage does one person get, because people have that sort of livability standard within our units now. And, you know, we've said it's not bunk beds and dorms, but will we stay up with the same sort of livability standard that people need a little space to breathe and their own space? So that would be something to really check in on. And then the final is just kind of changing our language about this a little bit. You know, financial model, subsidy, whatever. Let's go back to the idea that the city can buy housing credits and the unit. And, you know, that's what it should be, is if we're going to be putting public subsidy dollars in to the project, or 505 funds or whatever, Apsha can buy those units. And you know, for the subsidy, we should get some units that go to the general lottery. Not we put in subsidy and now it pays for new growth. You know, I would be happy to put subsidy into a private sector developer's project for AH units that are catching up on shortfall. But I don't want to put public subsidy into a project that is creating more shortfall. And so I think that's easy enough to start saying, hey, we're there to do business with you, private sector, and we have money available, and we can subsidize a unit up to X amount. And, you know, maybe it's the same amount that they can sell a housing credit for, maybe it's more, I don't know. But why not be a little more straightforward and direct about how the subsidy gets to the developer and what type of units we get out of it?
Okay. We've heard a lot of great comments, and some of this we've gotten some feedback from you on already. From the very beginning of the conversation, it does seem that council continues to seek improvements to the AH credits program to continue to make it viable and attractive to the private sector. Questions number 2 and 3 on this list, though, and we've heard some statements towards both of these. Are there, across council, either the objectives kind of wholly or specific tactics that seem most important or in line with council expectations? And conversely, I think we can probably deal with this in similar comments. Are there objectives or tactics that council does not wish for staff to pursue any further in this list of things that we just talked about?
Do you need those reiterated? You've heard some.
You've heard some.
So, Skippy, since I can't see you, do you care to do you care to start in on this?
Sure. Yeah, I definitely want to pursue improvements to the credits program. I think I'd like to pursue all of the above, with the exception of moving outside the urban growth boundary. I'd like to leave that off of the things we're pursuing now, and we can bring it back later if it's an absolute last. But seeing that it has a small financial impact and I think a big negative community impact and precedential impact, I would just leave that on the cutting room floor now. But I would pursue the rest of them, and I would do so with the recognition that in the marathon of housing, if the finish line at 26.2 is people living in these credits units, we're at mile 2. We've decided we're going to run the race. We've got our shoes on, we got our gear, and we're moving, but we have a long way to go to work through all of these and determine which of these numerous and creative things are viable, inviable, more and less efficacious. And I want to hugely thank staff. I mean, reading this packet, it just gives me a little thrill. The degree of creativity, bold, out-of-the-box thinking, expertise embedded in this document is sensational. And it's not a surprise because I see it frequently, but it just is really on display here, or maybe this is just one of those things that I understand enough to see it in. And then, there were a few things that I think we had comments on that were a little maybe adjacent to staff suggestions that I'd like to see considered, but they were all previously mentioned, and I'm sure staff has notes.
Thank you. John?
I concur with Skippy. I think the only thing I don't really want to pursue is expanding the environment on which we could build AH. Because the same reason Skippy gave, it doesn't, the cost is no different, and it kind of seems like we'd be going backwards and trying to keep our employees on the inside of the roundabout and keep our employees off Highway 82. So thanks to staff and design workshop for giving us all these options.
Thanks, John. Rachel?
Yeah, thank you. I echo the comments about the work you've put in. This is really good, and we wouldn't be able to pick at it if you hadn't made such a great spread. But I certainly agree about the urban growth boundary, and I think that maybe there needs to be a refresher on what was the purpose of the urban growth boundary and why. I mean, the original urban growth boundary for housing went all the way out to Aspen Village, and it was later pulled back in by the next iteration of the community plan. I don't know why, but that happened. So I guess for me, looking at any of these is to really poke at it from all the sides and say, how does this really play out? Kind of like I was just saying about, getting the 2-for-1 credit, and then the unit is really only serving that purpose for 10 years instead of 50. How does it really play out? Who really moves into the ROs? Is it going to be cashing out all the free market that remain, or is it going to be getting people who move out? How are the projects designed? Are they really move to, if they're going to be getting these sort of credits that people want, or is it just going to be cookie cutter? It's a project, it's a unit, and we find that people don't want to move out to it, and they're not willing to move to it, and it didn't really fulfill that. The biggest bottom line for me is how can we tweak the program, or how can projects be accomplished where we're catching on shortfall and not developing more shortfall. And I think that every presentation about the approvals to an AH project, whether they're in front of P&Z or this board, should have the number of how many people will be unhoused by this project. We're getting credits for this 65%, but this is how many people are being turned into the regular market as well. And we just need to keep an eye on that growth. Maybe it does lead to raising the mitigation standard in the future. I don't know, but I mean, I think we've already made some pretty significant changes already. So that's, I think, the real thing we have to be able to talk to our public about, our partners like the Board of County Commissioners. Are we growth generators? Have we created a program to just start generating more and more commercial growth? The other thing I had mentioned earlier was, is should there be a ratio on site? And should, I know that would also be very different per land mass and per, zoning area and everything like that. But I don't think any project should be able to say 100% off-site for our housing. And, depending on how many credits they want to get, that's where I am coming up with the idea of a ratio. But we need more in town. That's what creates year-round community. That is what supports a business in so many ways. So this has become, to me, too much of an escape route for off-site. Thank you. Thank you. Maybe there's a different pricing difference. If somebody has put X amount on site, there can be a pricing difference, or even a mitigation reduction if more are on site, because we're already approving projects that are X amount unmitigated.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Rachel.
I know if I wait long enough, Rachel's going to express my ideas. I had also thought about a way to encourage on-site mitigation, and even to the point of maybe housing credits. There should be an incentive for building employee housing units on site. So
that you can't use housing credits unless you have X many on site.
Or somebody who gets builds the housing units on the site that is owned.
Credits and sell credits.
Yeah, to meet their own mitigation. As far as the,
Wait a second. You just confused me there. That was again that double dipping.
Yeah.
You build it for your employee and you sell a credit to someone else who has an unmitigated employee. That would fly.
let's just use an example. Somebody owns a piece of property. They have a 5-acre piece of property, and they have approvals for building so much that has created employee housing mitigation of X. They don't want to build it on site, but maybe somebody else will build it on site for them as a partnership, in that they can buy those credits as mitigation for the fight.
Yeah, that I understand. For a minute, the way you explained it, it sounded like you're selling it twice. They get to mitigate
Well,
their
if I
employee,
could
and they
do
get to
that, I
sell it.
would.
Great business model.
Yeah. What I'd like to be able to see is how we can employ the public-private partnerships and untether it from growth mitigation. If there's a way that we can get, even having 150 fund contributions to get housing without having to build it, the city having to build it 100%. As far as urban growth boundary, I think one of the objectives of urban growth boundaries is you don't want to create sprawl. But on the other hand, we've already purchased 2 units that are beyond the urban growth boundary. The reality is that there's only so much land, there are only so many opportunities within the urban growth boundary, and if we have the opportunity to purchase something, convert it to workforce housing, and not have it development neutral, not have to have construction, and it fits the right, it's close to transportation corridor. I'd like to look at that, because it's a regional, the shortage of housing is regional. And at some point, we're going to have to say, we don't want to allow commercial growth, but the urban growth boundary is beyond city limits. So if we can encourage the purchase of existing units without having to do development that qualify by being on a corridor, transportation corridor, not having to build, not having to demolish, not having to contribute to the landfill, I would, I'd really be curious at looking at a way to do that. Those are my main, to encourage on-site mitigation and any untethering the use of housing credits to mitigation for new growth.
Thanks, Ward. I agree. Thank you for your work on this. I don't see a whole bunch of potential here. Which is sad to me because the credit program, when it started, I was very hopeful that there was going to be avenues here to meet some of our goals and objectives, but the market has changed. So I'd like to continue some of the work here, but I think that there's a breaking point for a lot of these tools and levers, and I don't support making something work at all costs, at any cost. I agree with a lot of the points that Rachel made throughout these presentations. So you can kind of put a check mark next to a lot of her comments as being reiterated by me. I'm interested in shaking the tree a little longer, but I got to be honest, I don't know that this program is effective in returning to us what we're trying to get done here. Number 5, credits as incentive. Deed restrictions that are sunsetting is something that I'm concerned about. The note that I put here in different language, but buying down and development neutral and stuff. That of all of them probably was most interesting to me. But again, Rachel made a comment that was about how much would you issue in certain circumstances, and I agree. I'm very cautious about that as well. So I think some great points have been brought up here. Obviously, the number one is about as a growth enabler and making sure that we're not going to any and all lengths in order to fulfill that. So you have support to, work on these some more, but I will be honest with you, if you were to come back next year and say, hey, we can't get much closer, or this is as close as we can get, I'm ready for that. I do not expect you to necessarily be successful in finding a formula that works here. So that's really all I can add to it for you.
Thank you for those comments. And I don't think anything that's been said this evening is surprising to staff. I think we've filtered a lot of this stuff previously, and I think I think your comments are super helpful as we frame next steps. I do think that staff continues to think there's opportunity here. We think the program's been successful in creating, I think, the kinds of developments that the council's identified as being successful, smaller infill, kind of filling in gaps in our neighborhoods, and some really successful projects have been created out of this program. But we get the reality of the situation. There's some striking conditions out in our marketplace that are difficult to overcome. So we certainly hear all of that.
And Ben, if I can just jump in on that, in response to one of your comments, Meritori, I mean, if if we get to a point where council doesn't feel as though there are reasonable responses to continue to optimize the credits program, that does beg a really important next question for us, which is, what would council like us to do with respect to the relationship between the credits program and how we allow development permitted as of right to mitigate its affordable housing demand? And we're not there right now, but again, I will just remind you, we've had a series of what we're calling batched requests for fee in lieu for development, which has a mitigation requirement, which we are requiring them to meet, but they can't purchase credits on the market right now. That condition will continue to obtain in the market for the foreseeable future. We do not anticipate more credits coming on in a meaningful way. And so with that in mind, we continue to feel like we are operating under some time constraint with respect to responding to that dynamic. And this discussion is sort of advancing that issue a little bit, but just wanted to remind council of that. And also, there were some comments made this evening which are absolutely on the nose with respect to the relationship between development, affordable housing generation and mitigation, and the credits program. There are comments about sort of development neutral solutions. And Councilmember Howenstein suggested untethering credits from development. And I would just remind council and the community, because this is something that I don't think gets named in public all that often when we're talking about housing and growth and development and all these interrelated issues. The system of affordable housing development for the private sector in this community is predicated entirely on development. Whether we call that development growth or not is another conversation. But there is a straight line to be drawn from development to employee generation, employee mitigation, and the demand for affordable housing. The only alternative to that exists presently is the city as the developer model. And the credits program was sort of conceived of as not a total alternative to that, because there is, again, that development relationship. But the credits projects to date are the only example of non-city driven affordable housing development that is not directly tied to a specific land use approval. And I just want to state that out loud, because that's not something that we used as the sort of primer for this discussion. And if we continue to sort of work our way through these issues, and that relationship between development or growth, if you want to call it that, and housing continues to be a topic, then I feel like that's something we ought to dig deeper into from a policy standpoint, because again, we may find ourselves in a place where even big ideas are failing to really address the policy needs being articulated by this body or as you perceive them by the community. So.
Philip, I agree with you very much. I know what you're saying, and I appreciate that both as a reminder to the boards and to the heads up to the public. The only thing I'd add to it is it's more that from the outside, watching over time, it's become the preferred tool in such a way that projects are no longer designing themselves to say, we can put 6 units on this corner of the building and we can put these here. It's become, we can buy credits and we don't have to put any of it on site. I mean, and that's just been a shift in the development market. They responded to the tool that happened. And so given the limited amount of land and things like that, that's why I think that is of a concern, and it's become a concern. We've become the engine to allow development to occur by developing sites for the credits. What I would also add on to that is I'm, again, more than happy to work with the private sector. I don't like to see the city necessarily as always the big developer, whether it's Lumberyard or Burlingame 3 or even smaller projects. But I would be happy to buy into the developer's project. I would be happy to see us buy in and extinguish that credit without any new growth and make their pro forma and their profit happen. So I just think thinking about that a little more directly, how do we get into units that go to APCHA, that make the pro forma work, that make the private sector happy and busy and do what they do best. And at the same time, it doesn't have to be development driven. That's where our money should come in. Thank you.
Thanks.
Can I?
Yeah, I'm just trying to get my head around what you said, Philip, about city as developer. I'm wondering if what you are perhaps suggesting is that, let's say at the lumber yard, the city purchases a couple of units and says these are available for purchase as housing credits for mitigation?
No. I'm not making any sort of suggestions about policy or program with respect to city affordable housing developments. I'm simply saying that either affordable housing is derived from extraction from free market development activities, or the city builds units. And the city does build units and has in the past and will in the future. The lumberyard's an example of that. So I'm not suggesting we change anything with that relationship. I was just pointing out that that's the only alternative to extracting the housing from free market development.
From, I think, our perspective, all of us, I think, feel that we want on-site mitigation as the most preferred, and fee in lieu is the least preferred. And if there's no alternative to fee in lieu, how can we provide an alternative? And if we could, as a city, purchase or build some units that could be sold as housing credits, so that we don't have to take fee in lieu, which is our least desirable mitigation. I'm just thinking out loud here, but from a policy level, because a certain percentage of your mitigation has to be on site.
It should be,
Yeah, and none of it can be fee in lieu.
Yes, it's kind of, the fee in lieu is a valuable tool in some instances where there's partial credit, all that kind of stuff. But yeah, I think we all, share that same kind of prioritization. Skippy, did you have a comment?
Yeah, I mean, I just want to jump in. I think this is all super valuable conversation, and I think we need to be careful to not sort of shoot the messenger in this one. I think, what we're discussing here is how to make one portion of our housing program, one tool in the credits, the most efficacious it can be. And I think we need to be careful to not demonize it for some broader architectural choices within the broader system. If we want to make up the shortfall, we can change the mitigation rate required to 100%, right? If we are worried about projects not coming to fruition, then that's a vesting rights issue. And so I think, focusing this on where we can do this best, and then the bigger questions, fair enough, right? Like, let's discuss those and change them if need be, but those are not specific to this. And while this being credits may have become more preferred over other types of delivery, we allow for all those. And if we want to change what's allowable, that's something that we can do. But it's also the case that, and I think the numbers earlier, 105 units over a little over a decade. I mean, I can think of 2 hotel projects that had that requirement for affordable housing. So it doesn't seem that these are being used for everything. And we're going to see more need for credit with the changes that we've, I think, very well made for mitigation in the residential sector. So I just want to have that, that I agree with the critiques, but let's not shoot the messenger note. And then the last thing I want to say is just to respond to what Philip said, which is it's absolutely right. Like, unless the city's building something, all of our housing development is required because of building. And all of us, I've heard all of us at some point during this say we prefer the development neutral option. And I couldn't agree more. And so I think, we just need to increasingly focus there. And I think, if we want to take out that piece, we need to look at the elephant in the room, which is vacancy. And are there dollars available from the choice to leave a property vacant, displacing housing, that could go into this equation? The subsidy numbers we saw that were somewhere between red and black are based on a particular number. But the truth is, if we choose to extend the subsidy number higher, we can always get to a pencil project, but we just don't have the dollars to do it. And could that be a dedicated revenue stream to do so and guarantee housing without those complications that, Rachel, you've highlighted? I think, we just got to increasingly start looking there.
Thanks, Skippy. John?
Yeah, I just want to give out some thank yous. First to Peter Fornell, who was here for most of the meeting, and he has actually helped us in our mission to provide housing for locals. Also to Sarah, who gave us the guidance during our retreat to focus on 3 areas. And we chose childcare, housing, and greenhouse gases. We addressed all 3 of those tonight. And I think that's great that we're making progress on all 3. Lastly, I want to thank you, Rachel. I think you bring such a depth of knowledge and perspective and everything else. The comments and questions you had tonight were, I think, very deep, and thank you.
Well said. Agreed.
We have another item that we want to discuss this
We
evening?
do. This one is much more constrained. Thank you for the policy gymnastics exercise that you just experienced with us. We appreciate it. I don't, we've had a long evening to this point, and I don't want to give this short shrift because this was a topic that at least a couple of our local community members during the moratorium conversation brought to our attention and wanted to have a very extended conversation about. And at the time, I think we were engaged in so many things, and this question, I think we responded to it in some ways by really tightening up the language on the deferral requirements when we have a deferral agreement and making that a much more improved and predictable document for people who are engaging in it. But, I think for a couple folks, they really in response to the increases that we made to the mitigation requirements for redevelopment scenarios, they were particularly concerned about the impacts of that to local residents who might engage in a redevelopment scenario. So, this is in the ballpark of the credits program and mitigation requirements and all that kind of stuff, but this is a fairly distinct and discrete topic. And I do want to just say that I think from staff's perspective, and this is consistent with the way that we talked about it during the moratorium conversation, is this deferral agreement that's been in place for a long time, I think was a really thoughtful tool when Aspen started on this path of requiring mitigation for residential development, to acknowledge, the position of local residents and not wanting to, give them reason to sort of give up their homes sooner than later. But we do think this deferral agreement remains perhaps the most important tool in responding to the concerns that local residents might have when facing a mitigation requirement for a project that they engage in at their residence. The 2 suggestions, and these might be overly simplified, but I think they get to the essence. And again, much like everything we talked about during the credits discussion, getting either one of these right would take some work, and putting guardrails in place and review processes in place and making sure that we weren't giving unintended benefit to folks, or being unfair to others. So the first of the 2 scenarios that were proposed, and again, both of these have the effect of either reducing or kind of expanding the deferral that mitigation requirements would have on local residents who engage in a redevelopment or sold their property. I think that's important too, particularly on number 2, sold their property for a future redevelopment scenario, or to another party who was contemplating a redevelopment scenario. So the first one, I think, perhaps is most directly related to our current deferral agreement, where someone wants to redevelop their home, cross the demolition threshold. We're going to have significant mitigation requirements in place, and wanted to continue to live in their home following that significant remodel or full redevelopment of their property. And the suggestion at the time was to reduce that mitigation requirement for the number of years that resident continued to live in their home. The second scenario is different in that it suggested that, a long-standing family who lived in Aspen, lived in their home, raised their kids, maybe rented out their basement to somebody over time, that, they provided housing to the community, both for their family and others who might have lived in their home over the years. And that resident would get a credit for the number of years that they've lived in their home. The suggestion here is that they've contributed to, housing local residents. But I think the interesting thing about the suggestion is that the credit would then be applied to reduce or eliminate future mitigation requirements, either for the resident or to the property, in total in a redevelopment scenario. And so I think the suggestion here is that this doesn't just reduce a direct mitigation requirement on the resident, but it has implications to their property value as they might sell that property to, potentially sell it to a future buyer. So both of these were proposed. There's simplified versions of what kind of were discussed and presented when we had this conversation at the moratorium. But we said we were going to bring this back for your consideration to see if you wanted staff to give additional study to this and come back with a formal proposal. I will say that neither of these scenarios are undoable in terms of a regulatory response, but there's some challenge in them. And from staff's view, the deferral agreement is still, I think, a tried and true and improved tool to kind of respond to some of these concerns from local residents. So on this topic, and we can talk through both of these scenarios a little bit more about what the response might be like. But the question for you is do you desire for staff to look into this topic further, or is your perspective that the deferral agreement is sufficient at this time?
Thank you. Skippy?
Yeah, I'll try to keep it brief. I feel like the deferral agreement is a fair and correct bargain. I'm not interested in pursuing changes at this time. We are in the position of trying to claw back sunsetting deed restrictions across the community. Why we would enshrine a new class of sunsetting deed restrictions with some of the most valuable property around is just not clear to me. No one's made a compelling case for that. So, I think it's currently correct. If you are mitigating for your affordable housing by your own being on the property or renting to a qualified person, then that counts as a deferral up until the point where you voluntarily choose for profit to end the condition of affordable housing. And so I think it's perfectly fine as now. The only liner note I would add, which we kind of discussed earlier as a potential opportunity for the owner who would be interested in seeing a change here, might be an opportunity for them to get some kind of credit for RO deed restricting their home while they live in it so that they can get some cash out, but stay in the community through the rest of their life. Or maybe they could get some cash benefit for an agreement that whenever they do sell in life or posthumously, that they are selling exclusively to a developer, city or otherwise, who will build deed-restricted affordable housing of some kind at that time. That could be like a type of benefit that I could see that would have the added benefit of the community of keeping that person in town. But short of that, I just don't see any justification for making a change here.
Thank you for starting that off. Rachel?
Thank you. I agree with Skippy's conclusion related to maintaining the current deferral agreement. I reached it at a different way of getting there. Can you flip back to your last screen for a second? Mm-hmm. I just thought about if either of these scenarios were applied to vacant commercial property. And argument could be made, well, I've let it sit vacant for 30 years. We never generated any employees. Think about all the employee demand I have kept away from the city for the past 30 or 40 years. So I want credit now so that that whoever does develop this property in the future doesn't have to mitigate. If we just substituted commercial in on these asks for exceptions, look, I never built that second floor of my building when there was no mitigation requirement, and I've left it just airspace for the past 20, 40 years, and now I want credit so that when we do develop the second floor on the building, we don't have to mitigate. doesn't ring true. I think a deferral agreement is fair. It's something we've used in the past, and I would continue to support it. Thank you.
Thanks. May go last.
Sure you can. John, any comments here?
Not on this one.
Okay, I'll come back to you because we may need you.
Could you voice yours because?
Let's see. I was interested in this when we were having conversations about it, so I am not a no. But reading this packet, I was stuck on the second one. That did not intrigue me. The first one, I understood. And from our conversations in the moratorium, the first one is one that I would, of these two, I would support. But I think our deferral process does handle the situation. So I would need more discussion on this. I'd need to run through a couple more kind of this and that and what the timeframes would be, what the mitigation requirements and reductions would be. I mean, I could entertain number one, but.
Yeah, you know, Tori, the one thing that's really so open-ended about one is a local full-time resident who's been here 3 years, 15 years, 30 years. Do you start counting backwards on each one? You know, what is the timeline? Do you have to have lived here 40 years for that to be reduced? Or does every home who comes in to redevelop, I'm a local, I'm a full-time resident, but I've only lived here 18 months. And I'm going to redevelop, but it's going to get reduced now by 18 months.
No, this is going forward.
I know, it's going forward when people want to redevelop their home. But what I'm saying is, do you say the cutoff is someone who's owned their home for 5 years, 10 years, 25 years, or 30 years before they start getting their mitigation reduced? You know, to nothing, to zero. You know, and I understand you may have thought about other guidelines around this, but right now it's just reading that, and there's hundreds and hundreds of homes that a local lives in now that will be redeveloped in the future. That's all I can say. So it just, does it start the day you became a full-time local? You can start counting backwards that you won't have to mitigate when you redeveloped.
Yeah.
And to add on to that, maybe this isn't an issue, but if you put a time requirement on it and you say it's got to be somebody who's lived here 30 years, the person who's lived here 29 is going to have a problem with that.
Yeah. And the same one who's lived here 21.
Yeah.
15.
Same problem the 21-year-old has when he goes to buy a six-pack.
Yeah.
I think, I don't want to say no to any of this. I think we still need to look at this, but it's obviously pretty problematic.
Ben you might want to hear what he has to say.
Well, I think it's an appropriate conversation, and I think it's one of staff's concerns is the ownership mechanisms that exist in this town and the relationships of individuals to trusts and LLCs and all those kinds of things are really difficult for staff to navigate.
Really
and so, I think we asked, on the demolition topic, we did carve off a couple of additional demolition allotments for folks that could show evidence that they or their family had lived in, and we picked 35 years at that time. But it is one of staff's concerns on either one of these is just that measure, that evaluation, that assurance that the folks that we're trying to really address and their concerns on this topic are the folks that we're actually going to be addressing in any policy that we would put forward, just because of how difficult and complicated those ownership relationships are and the relationship to family trusts and all those kinds of things. It becomes a little murky and difficult for, I think, any of us to evaluate. That's one of the concerns that we have about this. So I think the conversation at the council table right now is appropriate.
Yeah, I asked to go last on this because this does affect me. And I've lived in my current residence for 40 years. And I think the value of our residence has increased a little bit. And I think that when we sell our property, if we cash out, that it's time for somebody to pay for workforce housing mitigation. I think that if we sell our residence at some point and we sell it as a buy down, as Skippy had suggested, and what we've suggested for some other properties, that you wouldn't have to have workforce mitigation if you sold it to a deed restriction and deeded it as workforce housing. You could sell it for, we could sell our property for well above what we have into it, and well below what free market is, and still be a tremendous asset to the community. I don't want to go down the rabbit hole of saying, well, we've lived in our house over 30 years, therefore we don't require mitigation when we sell it. I just think that, speaking for myself, I think that if I cash out, if we move, that whoever buys it can pay for that workforce housing mitigation, because, or I can discount it for the sale price because there's been a capital gain. So it could directly affect me, but I think it's equitable and fair that whoever purchases our property has to have some kind of workforce housing mitigation.
So I think we heard very clear statements, and I just want to confirm, because I will say work on this would be fairly complex, and we'd need to give some time and energy to that. I heard no from three of you, and I just wanted to confirm that that was the case.
Correct.
I think that's, yeah.
Stick with the current deferral agreement.
Okay. Thank you for that. With that, I think we've talked about this already. We will go back to the table and do some additional work, kind of think about, our analysis that we've done, and you'll likely see us coming back to you with some further conversation on the credits program sooner than later in 2023.
Thank you guys. Such great and in-depth work. And I appreciate all the conversation amongst council, like the depth of understanding here is pretty amazing.
Very good.
Thanks.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you guys so much
Thank you.
for taking us to
Bye,
7:45 this evening.
Hope I can see you guys tomorrow.
Yeah, Skippy, safe travels.
Okay. Bye.
He'll be back?
No,
Oh.
it'll be Zoom tomorrow.
You can always have an extra addendum.
Sure.
That's very nice. Oh, looking at
But
this.
you are Siri, and you shouldn't take offense.
No, it's just, I was thinking I have an extra copy at home I haven't given you. It's called A Citizen's Guide to Land Use.
Oh,
And multiple people have given that me over the years, so I have 2 copies.
oh, good.
It's just,
Who is that lady?
try to think on the flip side of things. I think a lot.
And that's just it. You've been around long enough, you've seen some things.
Yeah, and I have a real estate license and
That gives you the ability to,
flip it around a little.
when you get X, what happens with Y?
Yeah. Yeah, I know. It's too easy to, almost all of our programs, any government program,
Right.
it starts off with the best of intentions,
None of them are in a silo.
and there's always unintended consequences, and then there's changed conditions that come up, and
The best intentions.
you gotta evaluate what's happened.